started. I'll unmute myself. Thank you. Welcome to the January 22nd Fpdr board meeting. We will start with an approval of the minutes from last time.
For last meeting?
Are we missing a board member?
Yes, trustee Fouts is out today.
She's out today.
Yes.
Okay, great. We'll start with approval of minutes, and then we'll go to an introduction of visitors and everybody who's in the room. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes of the November 27th, 2018 meeting?
So moved.
A second.
Second. Were there any corrections or comments to the minutes? None. Great. Then let's take a vote. And everyone in favor of approving the minutes from the November meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, there are no nays. Minutes are approved. Okay, introduction of visitors. The trustees, we will start with introducing ourselves and then move to the rest of the room. I always enjoy this part of the meeting to see who's here. So,
Trustee Jason Lehman.
Trustee Catherine McLeod.
Trustee Jennifer Cooperman.
Trustee Brian Hunzeker.
And I am Kim Mitchell with Fpdr. I'm kind of pitching in for Sam Hutchison today.
Lauren Downtower with the Orchard Beacon Southside Fund Council.
Crystal Bucola, Police Liaison.
David Short, retired firefighter.
Nelson Hall, attorney. Matt Larrabee with Milliman Actuary Fund. Scott Carpenter with Milliman Actuary Fund.
Stacy Jenkins, Fpdr Finance Manager.
Bill Stevens, representing Portland retired firefighters.
Olivia Watman, attorney with Public Safety Labor Group. Kristen Johnson, financial policy advisor with Commissioner Harnstein.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Do we have anybody signed up for public comment? No comment. Great. Then let's move directly into our action items. Our actuarial valuation and levy and adequacy analysis.
Great.
Welcome, Stacy Jones.
Good afternoon. Stacy Jones, Fpdr Finance Manager, and I am just here for a second to introduce our fund actuaries from Milliman, Matt Larrabee and Scott Parpenow, who are going to give the biannual plan valuation results and the biannual tax levy analysis. All pension plans have valuations at least every 2 years. Some larger plans have them every year. We choose to have ours every other year. And then in concert with that, we asked actuaries to do something that's a little bit unusual, but makes sense given our dependence on our property tax levy, and that's to do a long-term look at the adequacy of the tax levy, given our $2.80 cap. So they will give you the results of both of those. And in your books, you have their presentation and also the formal valuation report. And I'll turn it over to them.
Welcome.
Okay, thanks. Guys, how's it going?
All right. Okay. So starting on slide 1 of our presentation, and for the record, I'm Scott Parpenow with Milliman, as mentioned. So as Stacy just covered, we have prepared our every 2-year actuarial valuation and levy adequacy modeling. That's what we're going to go through in the presentation here today. So slide 1 is pretty much just set up and reminder of what we've done, and slide 2 we'll start talking about the basis of the work we do. So the previous iteration of the valuation and the modeling was done as of June 30, 2016. The June 30, 2018 results we're talking about today, by and large, follow the same plan provisions as were used 2 years ago. There weren't any big significant changes this go round. That's a contrast to trustees who may remember who were here 2 years ago. There had been a lot going on in that last round of studies with changes in the FPDR2 COLA policy tied to Morrow decision with Oregon PERS, COLA, and arbitrator rulings on the 27 pay period calculation, and a new police contract that were all reflected at this time. In this go-round, there was a lot less sort of moving parts on the benefit payments of our valuation. There have been some assumption changes since the prior iteration of the work, most notably the discount rate and the mortality update. We'll talk about more in a little bit here, but those both kind of update as a normal course based on market conditions and based on the PERS, police and fire mortality assumption. The final point, which is relevant for levy modeling, but not for the valuation, is we always reflect the most current real market value for property tax as the starting point for our levy modeling. And that's gone up quite a bit since 2 years ago, and you'll see the impact of that in the modeling. Okay. So we'll start with the valuation results first, and I'll cover those, and then Matt will talk through the levy-related study. So slide 4 of the presentation, important to note what the valuation is used for and what it's not used for. So one of the primary purposes for the every 2-year actuarial valuation is for financial reporting. This is the starting point. The June 30, 2018 valuation is the starting point for financial reporting under the Government Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, that will be shown for the fund and for the city as of June 30, 2019 and June 30, 2020. So there's kind of a mapping exercise that happens under those GASB rules, and this is the starting point to be able to prepare those results that will be needed at the upcoming fiscal year ends. Because FPDR benefits are a pay-as-you-go structure, this valuation is not used, unlike some actuarial valuations, it's not really used for focusing on the funded status of the plan, because that's not really a meaningful construct in a pay-as-you-go system. You're not pre-funding the plan to pay out benefits in the future. And it's not used for determining the actual contribution rate, again, because that's not the way this fund works, but just for clarity of what this valuation does and doesn't do. Slide 5, any actuarial valuation of a pension plan is a very long-term calculation. So as of June 30, 2018, for example, benefit payments to retired and disabled FPDR members were on the order of 10 to 11 million per month. And we have to project that out, annual benefit payments for not only current retirees, but current active employees when they retire and then through the course of their retirement. So it's a decades and decades long projection that we do. As you'll see in a more graphical format in a few slides, the benefit payments are projected to grow for nearly the next 20 years in our model before they start to decline and tail off towards the later years of the model. But given that it's such a long-term exercise, this calculation, anytime you're doing that and then assigning a financial value to it, the assumptions you use play a key role in the results you get. It's a very long-term exercise. The assumptions are very meaningful. Moving on to the next slide, slide 6, we'll give a brief update on some of the key assumptions that we use in our work. And these were discussed with Trustee Lehman and Trustee McLeod in a subcommittee meeting in November. In general, this valuation, many of the assumptions are unchanged since the June 30, 2016 valuation and the 2014 experience study. So for reference, it's the best practice for a public plan, usually do an experience study every 5 to 10 years. We last did one in 2014 and anticipate doing one in 2020, so a 6-year window, but we're still in the time frame where those 2014 experience study results are quite current. And so for the most part, a lot of those assumptions are held steady. The two assumptions called out here that we do update as a matter of course in every valuation are the discount rate, because that is defined as by reference to a market rate that's a municipal bond index. This is tied to the Government Accounting Standards Board requirement and how this works. So what we always do, every valuation date, we're taking the most recent published rate and using that as our new discount rate. The second item here, mortality. In 2014, as part of the experience study, the board approved the use of the Oregon PERS police and fire mortality assumption. And so Oregon PERS does an experience study actually every 2 years, which is extremely frequent for a public plan. And so we're just updating to keep the link to the change that they made in their most recent study. And the rationale for tying to the Oregon PERS assumption is just it's a much bigger pool of police and fire eligible members. For something like mortality, the bigger the pool you have to set an assumption, the more stable it's going to be and the more credible it is in a statistical term. The one other, though we didn't make a change with this assumption, the one other assumption we really did look at pretty closely for this updated evaluation was the load we apply for assumed effect of the 27 pay period adjustments to reflect that some retirees will retire in a month where they get 27 pay periods rather than 26 in their final calculation. So in 2016, we'd had to introduce a new assumption because that was a change in the plan. We didn't have a whole lot of data to go on, had a little bit and made an assumption at that time. So we wanted to make sure we took a good look at that with the most recent 2 years of data. The load we applied in the prior evaluation was 2.5% of final pay, which works out, if you kind of do the math, it's roughly equivalent to if about 65% of members retired in a month where they got the higher 27 pay period counting. And that was broadly consistent with what we've actually seen in the last 2 years. I think it was between 60 and 65% was the average overall for the most recent 2 fiscal years. So we don't recommend any changes to that at this time. We'll definitely look at that with more years of data at the next experience study. And please feel free to jump in with questions at any time if you didn't say that earlier. Slide 7, just a little more detail on the discount rate and mortality that I mentioned. The graph there shows the discount rate over the last several fiscal year ends. So the June 16 rate that's called out of 2.85% was our discount rate for the last valuation. As you can see, that was kind of a low watermark for where this municipal bond index has been over the last 4 or 5 years. Most recently, at the June 30, 18 date that we care about for the valuation, it was up over 100 basis points to 3.87%. So what that means, it's quite a bit higher discount rate relative to the prior valuation, which means that the liability we show will be lower. A higher discount rate is more discounting of those future benefit payments, and so it reduces the liability. Even with the same stream of benefit payments, it's just recalculating the present value. And mortality, I mentioned keeping the link to the Oregon PERS assumption. That assumption was updated in July 2017 in their experience study. The net effect on the Fpdr plan when we introduced that new assumption was to pretty modestly lower the liabilities. The new assumption increased life expectancy at some ages, decreased it at others, but overall it was a little bit of a net decrease in the liability. Slide 8. Already kind of covered that there were not any significant changes in the benefit provisions compared to the past valuation. Important to note that both the 16 and the 18 valuations use the modified PERS COLA structure, so detailed there, 2% for service prior to October 8th, 2013, and 1.25% for service thereafter. Okay. All right, finally, before we start to get into the actual results of the valuation, slide 9. Just a reminder of the way liabilities are developed in the valuation. As I mentioned, there's a projection of benefit payments, discounting that back into a net present value, applying what's called, in the jargon, a cost allocation method to determine how much of that liability is considered to be attributable to the past, essentially, versus the future. What's the past is considered the actuarial accrued liability, so it's the liability kind of up to date, and then as called out in the bottom bullet here, what we would call the normal cost is the cost attributable to essentially service in the coming year, what's going to be earned in that next year, what portion of the liability. Okay. Slide 10 shows in graphical format this projection of benefit payments. So these are nominal, non-inflation adjusted benefit payments on this slide. And you can see that at the far left, where benefit payments are currently in around 125 to 130 million projected in 2018. That steadily grows over time to kind of the middle of this graph. In 2036, it's about 220 million. So that's the projection that's expected in the nominal benefit payments over time, and then declining after that. If you think about that time frame, that sort of peak number out there is about 30 years from the time the last FPDR2 member was hired. So once most to all FPDR2 members are expected to be retired, then the benefit payments payable out of this trust, out of this fund, decline over time. Other thing to note, so the green bars there are these projected benefit payments out of the current valuation. The black dashed line that sits pretty near the top of those is from the prior valuation. So that just shows graphically there was really very little change in the actual projected benefit payments compared to the prior valuation, which would not be the case if there had been significant changes in the plan provisions. Slide 11 takes those same benefit payments and adjusts those to be to essentially 2018 dollars in inflation adjusted dollars. So using an assumed 2.75% inflation.
I have a question.
Yeah,
You
of
just
course.
said that would not be accurate had there been significant changes to plan privileges.
So if there had been,
Provision. What would be an example of a provision that would change it?
so an example would be if we looked at, say, the June 30, 16 or even June 30, 14 versions of this study where in June 30, 14, I would say the COLA had changed due to 2013 PERS legislation that had reduced the COLA from 2% to 1.25 was the highest that was going to be paid under PERS. And so that reduced, if you look back at the parallel slide there, you would have seen that the green bars would have been a lot below the prior valuation because the cost of living adjustment paid in the future was
Less
going to
than.
projected to be lower.
Got
And
it.
then after the Morrow decision, it kind of the reverse, it popped back up.
Okay.
So in the last two iterations, there had been more changes over the 2-year period, and now it's been more stable.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So slide 11 is the inflation-adjusted versions of those. And so, again, what you see is that rather than nominal terms and more of real dollar terms, it's not quite as big a growth in the bars here over time and the benefit payments over time. But then you do see that decline sort of in that same time frame we were talking about in the mid-2030s and after, where the benefit payments measured on this basis start to decline as well. Any questions on that? Slide 12, just turning this into a kind of actuarial accrued liability that becomes relevant for example, for the financial reporting. The left column there is from the 2016 valuation, and the right column is from the 2018 valuation. Again, calling out the change in the discount rate, 2.85% last time, 3.87% this time, and you really see that impact in the middle of this table, the actuarial accrued liability, where it was almost $3.7 billion at the last valuation. Even though the projected benefit payments are essentially the same, the actual accrued liability calculated from those benefit payments is now $3.3 billion rather than 3.7 due to the effect of the discount rate. Final slide on the valuation before we move it on
I'm
to
sorry,
levy.
but
Oh,
one
of
quick
course.
question.
Trustee Todd.
On the normal cost itself, do you happen to know, or could you just find out, what portion of that normal cost decrease related to the reduction in active population, because this is for a closed population, correct? Versus the discount rate change?
Right.
Or
Well,
the
it's not purely closed in that FPDR 3 still count in our valuation, but they just count for the disability and death benefit, the more ancillary benefits rather than a retirement. So it has the same effect as their normal cost is lower than the FPDR 2 members they're replacing. So I don't have that with me at the moment, but certainly could answer that. We have that parsed elsewhere.
Can I jump in? And for the record, I'm Matt Larrabee with Milliman in Portland, so it's a good question, Trustee McLeod. Not having the number right in front of us, but looking at this and with our knowledge of the system and other systems, I would anticipate we see here about a $24 million decrease in the normal cost year over year. The majority of that decrease is going to come from that change in the discount rate, and the lowering of FPDR2 headcount is going to be a secondary player. So it might be about a 2/3, 1/3 split would be my gut response to that.
So slide 13 shows some of those changes over the 2-year period, but on the actual accrued liability basis rather than the normal cost. But what you will see there is that in that change from the $3.7 billion to the about $3.3 billion in the liability side, the discount rate is the big player there as well, about $550 million decrease due to the change in the discount rate. The other pieces there are not nearly as big. You can see the mortality was a slight decrease, $35 million. slight relative to the discount rate, certainly. The overall experience over the 2-year period was approximately $70 million loss. The biggest single piece of that was due to recent salary growth above long-term expectation. And that was about 40 million out of that 70 million, and then there were some other, smaller pieces in there. So any questions on that before Matt moves on to the levy adequacy modeling?
I'll ask, what was the change in assumption for disability medical? What was that relating to?
So that was just this is a load that we review every 2 years based on recent data, and we moved the assumption up. I think it was from a 0.5% load to a 0.65% load based on the most recent kind of 4-year period.
Okay, thanks.
And, sorry.
Of course.
The 69.3 million,
Yeah.
salary growth above the long-term assumption, was that because of the headcount FTE or the salary the salary itself?
Right.
Per person?
The short answer is both, but the biggest piece was the growth in the actual average salary. Not, the headcount didn't change dramatically, but it did increase a little bit, and then the actual average for continuing actives was the bigger driver there.
All right, now Scott walked you through the valuation, which I'm going to describe as the boring part of the presentation. I don't want to oversell things. I'm not going to call this the exciting part of the presentation. It's just the slightly less boring part of the analysis that we did. So the valuation, remind you that Scott summarized, that's really because of FPDR's unique circumstances, that is not for funding, funding profiles, funding anything like that, like we do with PERS or with other kind of more typical pension systems. That's just simply for financial reporting compliance purposes for the fund's CAFR and for the city's CAFR, as it plays a role in the city's financials as well. Second part of our analysis, and something that's very unique that we only do for FPDR, is the levy adequacy modeling. This is more focused on funding because the levy is the funding mechanism for the FPDR benefits for police and fire members in the city. Of course, the levy itself, when you say levy, that's a rate. It's a rate of RMV. So there's some systematic steps that we go through to get to the projected rates in our analysis, projected both for next year and all the years into the future. And so I'll kind of slow walk everybody through that. Certainly happy to field questions as we go along with it. So, again, first slide, slide 15, levy rate, really, a levy is a rate, it's a contribution amount, it's a fraction. Contribution amount is a numerator, RMV, city properties taxable as a denominator. First part of our building block is focusing on the projected contribution amounts. As illustrated in this slide or detailed here, there's really, at a high level, 2 subcomponents to the contributions. The first one is the pay-as-you-go subcomponent. That's the as we go along funding for the FPDR and FPDR 1 and 2 members. That includes their death, disability, and disability-related medical benefits. Also, any projected benefits we have that would be payable from FPDR rather than PERS for FPDR 3 members that would be eligible, them or their beneficiaries, for death, disability, or disability-related medical. We also put a load in there for administrative and projected operating expenses for the program in future years. The second component of the levy, based on how it is implemented, are the pre-funded costs, that subcomponent. And really, that consists of 2 pieces. First off, there's a variable contribution that's paid to Oregon PERS on Oregon PERS payroll for FPDR 3 members. And as indicated on that slide, it covers, the normal cost, which is the value of the benefit. It covers unfunded liability amortization to the extent that PERS is behind on its funding program. Right now, there's contributions made to Oregon PERS to try to eliminate the underfunding systematically over time. That's included in this component of it. And there's also a fixed 9% of payroll contribution to the IAP, which is a defined contribution program that PERS members that are in FPDR 3 participate in. So kind of a defined benefit piece and a defined contribution piece. 2 major components to the contribution level. So moving on to the next slide, during and then this is not a new slide, but it's one it's always important for us to bring up to the board and the trustees and other interested parties. During the projection period of our levy analysis, we're really simultaneously finding, as you know, kind of two generations of Portland Police and Fire employees and retirees, and we're doing that in different manners. For our FPDR1 and FPDR2 members, they're getting funded on a pay-as-you-go basis, and that funding doesn't commence until time of retirement or disability. For our FPDR3 members, we are attempting to pre-fund them through the Oregon PERS program. So one cohort we're funding in their retirement years, and the second cohort we're funding at the same time in their active working years. So it is both natural and an intentional consequence of this that we're having higher levies and higher near-term costs during this transition from a pay-as-you-go system very gradually over time to a pre-funded system. So all of that, transitional period, of course, was driven by the 2006 city charter reform, and the effects of that city charter reform on long-term cost are significant. It's establishing lower projected benefit levels for our FPDR3 members versus our FPDR1 and 2 members. And also, it over the long term can produce savings in a different way for the funding entities and city residents like ourselves, which is that the FPDR3 benefits, because they come from PERS, they are pre-funded. If you pre-fund the benefits during someone's working career, when they actually get to those retirement years, not 100% of the benefits for the members is coming directly from today's contribution. Instead, hopefully you can get 30% maybe from pre-funding and 70% from investment earnings on those pre-funded contributions that accrued during the member's working career. That's kind of the working theory behind that. So while that's a lovely long-term theory, the effects of this 2006 reform, they accrue very, and I mean very slowly over time, and the most dramatic impact, as you'll see in our levy adequacy analysis, is more than 20 years out, basically when almost all or all of our FPDR2 members have gone into retirement status, so we've transitioned fully away from the pay-as-you-go portion of this kind of two-generation stool, if you will, of funding. Bad analogy since stools don't have two legs. So moving on to the next slide here. It is a model. It's not a guarantee of what will occur, and we have some uncertainties about a variety of things in the future. Inflation is uncertain in the future to the extent that investment returns on the PERS fund affect this. There's some uncertainty there in the future. And of course, as we've seen very dramatically over the time that we work at the fund, RMV, which is a big portion of the levy calculation itself, that's uncertain and can be a little bit volatile, mostly good on RMV, but it has the potential to be bad at some points in the future. So in our model, we have 2 or 3 key things that we look at that drive the variability. Changes in RMV, they can deviate from our baseline forecast. We illustrate some tolerance for deviation there. And then, of course, Oregon PERS investments, we've got a baseline forecast, but then there's the potential for significant volatility, both in the near term and the long term, in terms of what the returns will be on the PERS trust. Important to note, as we do at the bottom of this slide, in terms of those forward-looking scenarios, a lot of our scenarios, there's linkage. So say RMV growth in the city's taxable properties isn't as high as our baseline would be. In a lot of our scenarios, unsurprisingly, that correlates with poor returns on the PERS investment trust. So the RMV isn't going up as much as we want. That would drive up at the levy. A lot of times simultaneously, that means the investment markets, the economy in general isn't going well. It's driving down the PERS returns, driving up the PERS rates, and so there's a little bit of a leveraged effect. We try to capture that kind of linkage in our model. So building blocks for our model. June 30, 2018 census of FPDR members, both actives and retires. The benefits is reflected as we understand them in the 2018 valuation. The RMV, which was provided to us by the city, of nearly $150 billion, and that was used as the basis for the 2018 levy request, also referred to as fiscal 19. Worth noting here, and this is a key thing, we'll get to it again later, that amount is 24% higher than the RMV that we showed when we did this analysis 2 years ago. So that'll be very impactful in terms of our levy projections when stated as rates. In consultation with the city economist, we make a baseline assumption about where RMV may go in the future, kind of long-term average growth at the 50th percentile of about 4.5%. And then we also have a financial model to try to figure out what's going on as best we can with the PERS trust and how that'll affect the FPDR3 members pre-funding. Cognizant of what's gone on in the investment markets in 2018 and not wanting to be neglectful of that. As a placeholder, we put a negative 5% return for Oregon PERS as an order of magnitude estimate for what we see in our model to try to reflect the bad December and bad November we had in the markets and how that may affect the PERS rates downstream. Okay, so moving on to slide 20. We've got some very busy charts coming up on the next slide, so one more table setter for this. Our rates, because these aren't certain, we're showing them as a probability distribution. We run 10,000 trials, and then we kind of summarize those trials in order, 1 to 10,000. We have these dots. They're very key to follow. They represent outcome 5,000 out of the 10,000 trials. So that's kind of our median or our 50th percentile. And then we graphically will show a spread from the 5th to the 95th percentile. So we're showing 90% of our modeled outcomes here. We're failing to show the top 5% and the bottom 5%, so those are our outliers, and they do spread out quite a bit. So first chart with lots of stuff. I mentioned this is focused on the contributions and on the funding. This is the first major component. It's the pay-as-you-go cost. So this is really the cost for FPDR2 actives who are going to be in retirement, their retirement payments, FPDR1 members, their retirement payments, both current and projected in the future here. And then we've got, the probability. It's a light one, but it's there, and we model it for FPDR3 members. There's very little spread visually in this from the 5th to the 95th percentile, and that's because our pay-as-you-go cost, which is the major component of the two funding subcomponents, is pretty darn fixed. The only things that really affect this are, what would be inflation affecting benefits to some extent for FPDR2 members, and also there can be some effects with timing, but, pretty predictable, and this is the bigger of the two funding components, is our FPDR2 and FPDR1 benefit payments. So, and this would be a parallel to slide 10 earlier in our presentation, those green bars that Scott showed. This is, the dots here are the cousin to that slide, pretty much identical. The second subcomponent of the funding, which is the numerator of the levy calculation, are the pre-funded costs to FPDR3 members, their payroll for Oregon PERS. Here we see a lot more variability. Oregon PERS rates are set every 2 years by the PERS board based on assumptions that they apply. They're pretty knowable in the very near term, as illustrated by the very limited amount of spread, particularly for 2019 to 21, where the PERS board has already approved the rates that will be going into effect for the 2019 to 2021 biennium for the state budget. The spread doesn't really exist too much in 22 and 23 because we're forecasting large increases again for Oregon PERS in the 21 to 23 biennium. The first time that we get any real deviation is out around 2024 or 25. And then you can see there's a huge amount of spread here. Generally speaking, following the dots here, which are the 50th percentile, that's kind of moving diagonal up to the right. That's not, in our view, a particular problem because this is on FPDR3 payroll. Right now, FPDR3 is about a third of payroll for the FPDR system. About 2/3 of it is still FPDR2 members. We get 5 years out, it's going to be a 50-50 split. We get 15 years out, it's going to be more like 90% FPDR3 members and 10% FPDR2 in terms of the payroll. So that diagonal on the dots, the 50th percentile in and of itself is not a concern. That's just a natural consequence of a very predictable projected path for FPDR3 over time gradually becoming the dominant portion of the system. And we do see a lot more spread, particularly on the right-hand side of this chart, some really good outcomes and some really bad outcomes. And that really is dependent on what happens with the investment markets with PERS. There's a potential in our model that PERS investment returns will be 9%, 10% or above. In that case, the costs on this will swing pretty low and the pre-funding will have been a tremendous success for the FPDR3 members. There's also a modeled possibility that the PERS returns could be far below the assumption, and in which case that's where we see the high end of this chart, and the costs would be higher, and the pre-funding would have been moderately successful, but not as successful as would have been hoped.
And can I interrupt to ask, what is the current assumption for investment return?
Sure, great question, Trustee McLeod. So the currently adopted assumption for the PERS board for future investment return on average is 7.2%. PERS board is required by statute to look at that assumption every 2 years, consistent with the state's 2-year budget cycle. The next review for that will begin in May and will conclude in July of
Okay.
this year.
And your median projections here, the dots are based on a continuation of that 7.2% return?
A good question
not?
as well, and the answer is not quite. We have our own model, so the PERS board adopted the 7.2%. They adopted that in July of 2017. Since then, investment markets, the forward-looking outlooks for the investment markets have kind of cooled down a little bit, and we have our own model, and we've got the details in the appendix of the presentation of what we were modeling year by year. Our projections for the PERS trust in this model come in a bit below the 7.2% assumption. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or is it good?
Yeah, our model forward-looking, it's between 6.5% and 7%. And then if you look we have a cumulative average in the appendix. That also builds in the 5% assumed loss in 2018 that Matt already mentioned. So that will actually look lower.
Yeah.
Like over this whole time frame, the median return is about 6% because it's that first bad year with
Followed by
more like
the assumed
by the
6.5 to
assumed
7.
6.5 to 7% after that. So just if you're trying to map the numbers sort of to the appendix, that's the kind of the decoder ring.
Okay, thank you. And so for these lower, where the costs are assumed to escalate, then that's for, in part, I'm sure there's other variables, but in part, continuation of returns less than that 6.5 to 7% you've been projecting.
Right. Yep, that's the primary driver on the pre-funded cost piece,
Thank you.
definitely.
Right.
Why is there significant change in 35, 36, and 37? Growth up and 36 dips. Why is that?
Good question, Trustee Hunsaker. So we have this will not come as a shock based on the way we talk. We have a very detailed model, and that includes a modeling of the PERS trust. The PERS trust, when 2008 happened, and there was a big negative investment return, the funding rates for PERS, the board's decision was to say, we're going to take that big investment loss from 2008, and we're going to try to systematically have rate increases that apply over a 20-year period. So what you're seeing when that dot goes down is an expiration of that 20-year funding effort to recover from the 2008 investment losses. And then the dot moves a little bit up to the right there because we've got some other effects going on. For example, the PERS board has now 3 reviews in a row changed their investment return assumption, which significantly affects the contribution rates. In 3 successive biennia, they went from 8 to 7.75 to 7.5 to 7.2, and that last move from 7.5 to 7.2 is why you see the little dot moving from the up to the 2037 rates, as we've got a little bump coming in there as well.
So if I restated that, you're saying that those are the expiration points for payoff of chunks of unfunded liability?
If I spoke
Right.
English as a first language, that is the way I would have put it.
Yes.
They speak well, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we kind of the 2 subcomponents, the pay-as-you-go and the pre-funded, that was the prior slide and this slide. This third slide is just A plus B equals C. So it's the combination of those 2. Most of the magnitude for this, the majority of it, is coming from the pay-as-you-go costs for the Fpdr 1 and 2 retirees for the projected future benefits for those employees in their retirement years, whereas all of the volatility, or the vast majority of the volatility, is coming from the uncertain effort and the uncertain requirements from the PERS trusts. So that prior slide was really, and the prior 3 slides were really kind of the actuarial numbers and how we develop them. But then in terms of turning that into a final levy in dollars, there are certain things about city finance where we would not consider ourselves the foremost experts. So we have our benefit projections, we have our projections for expenses and things like that. And then in consultation, particularly with fund staff and with the city economist, we know that, if you need a projected dollar amount of X isn't necessarily going to be the numerator in your levy calculation, because you need to make adjustments for a few things, and we talk about those here on our slide. There can be some other revenue sources that can come in, so if there's a reserve fund, there can be a little bit of investment earnings on those. There's certainly, you have to be contemplative of discounts for people that pay property taxes early, delinquencies for people that don't pay property taxes, and then there's the issue of tax compression, and that affects some properties as well. So you kind of take what you need as a dollar amount, and then you do some three-factor hand-waving style financial magic, and you come up with a different number that you actually put into the numerator of that levy fraction, levy calculation. So based on communications with the city economist, with Fpdr, kind of the combined effects of those is a 6% increase. You know, a couple of those drive things down, a couple of those drive things up, 6% increase on the prior slide's numbers to get to a final levy in dollars, which is shown here on slide 25. So really, this is an effort. We boost these up by 6% to try to, as effectively as we can and accurately as we can, model what we think the ask will be from city finance when it goes out to property holders in the city of Portland. And we think that this is going to be the best approximation of the numerator in that levy calculation, not just in next year, but over the span of the 20-year period that we're showing here. And then the final step of the mathematical work is to turn that dollar amount ask on the levy into an RMV rate and compare that RMV to make sure that it is not potentially trespassing the city charter, which places a $2.80 per $1,000 of RMV limit in terms of the levy that can go to fund the Fpdr program. Mentioned it previously. We did this modeling last 2 years ago on normal cycle. RMV has gone up 24%. When the denominator in a fraction goes up 24%, it really helps that levy rate in terms of it not being as high, because we've got a 24% bigger denominator, and we weren't anticipating at baseline that level of RMV growth in the prior 2 years. Because of that, both the median levy rate and the likelihood that the $2.80 levy cap will come into effect are markedly lower than on our prior modeling. And that's shown on this slide here, where we've got, the spread over time, a lot more certainty in the early years, less certainty because of the combined effects of the PERS returns, inflation, and what may or may happen, or what will the trajectory of RMV will be. A lot less certainty, certainly in the back half of this projection. But an important take-home from our perspective is that, the 5th to 95th percentiles, as you can see here, are far away from that $2.80 limit line. We don't show all the outliers. So the $2.80 in our modeling, the levy limit being exceeded in at least 1 year, that occurs in approximately 1% of our modeled scenarios. It doesn't mean in all years, and if it's happening, it's typically going to happen in the back half of the presentation, quite often around 2033, 2034, 2035, which will be kind of the tail end and the last few years of kind of that dual generation effort where we've got, kind of getting to the end of the runway in terms of funding 2 programs simultaneously as a response to the 2006 reforms.
And as I recall, the last time you did this analysis, that the red box read that the levy was exceeded in 1 year about 4 to 5%? Is that right?
I think last time it was between 2 and 3. It was like 2.5 or 2.6%.
Okay.
And then it was actually higher in the cycles before that. So it has been coming down as RMV has continued to outpace the baseline expectation.
Would you go back to slide 25 for a second? Make it 24, slide 24. The 6% increase. 6% increase of what?
Good question. A 6% increase of the amounts that we calculated here on slide 23.
Okay.
So the combination of the pre-funded component and the pay-as-you-go component, we put those two together.
Right.
And then we load that by 6% to what we think would be the mechanics for the levy calculation that the city sends out to property owners.
Thank you.
I was going to ask that same question. I still doesn't really I'm not getting it.
Okay.
Have you done this same thing in your analysis in the past?
Yes.
Yes.
We have that.
And we look at the assumption related to each of these kind of 3 items, the other revenue sources, compression, discounts and delinquencies, and run those by Fpdr staff and city economists and update them each time. So this time it worked out to about a 3% reduction for other revenue sources. So the total requirements we started from, we could use 3% less from that, but then we had to load it like 4 to 5% for discounts and delinquencies and load it for compression, and it worked out to about a net effect of a positive 6% load.
So is it
Put that all
because this
together.
part doesn't seem like science to me. Everything else you've kind of gone through seems like it's really in-depth, and this just kind of threw in a 6%. Is it a lot of work to come up with that 6%, or how do you, I mean,
If there was someone here in the city's finance function, I might defer to her and see if she has to say.
Talk about this yet?
Go back to the slide where you,
Yeah.
where it
Right
itemizes
here?
the
Yes.
sub-bullets that explain what goes
Okay.
into that 6%.
Absolutely.
All right, so let me take a little bit of a stab at that. I'm going to set aside the other revenue issue and just say, so when we say we need $100 million next year to run this fund, we cannot go out and levy $100 million. And that's because some people don't pay their property taxes, and those are delinquencies. Some people their properties are in compression to fit under that $10 per $1,000 of real market value general government limit. So some people will pay their full taxes, but they will not get taxed to the full extent of our levy because we'll be in compression. And some folks will take advantage of discount programs where if they pay in full by a certain date, they can pay less. So we can't just go out and levy that 100 million. We have to levy like 108 million because we're not going to get, and that means at the end of the day, we'll get our 100 million because we'll lose 8 million to discounts and delinquencies and compression. So estimating that is, in my opinion, one of the most complex things we do at the city, and I don't do it. Maybe that's why it seems so complicated. The city economist develops that projection for compression, and he is having to take account of the compression one is the most difficult. Delinquencies are connected to sort of macroeconomic conditions, as you might expect. Discounts are relatively stable. But compression means trying to figure out what is everybody else levying, you know? Is there a new local option levy coming in from the county, and is there a new thing going on here, and then going into this very complex model. And so he develops those assumptions on a go-forward basis. And then in addition to that, the upside that they're talking about here, the reason it's, because the effect of those three assumptions is actually right now about 8.3%. That's about how much we have to gross it up to account for those things. But then Matt and Scott can knock that down to 6% because they know that the property tax, it's almost all the money we get, but it's not quite all of the money we get. We get a little bit of money from fire and police on secondary work. We get a little bit of interest income. We get a little bit of money from a few other places. Does that make sense?
yeah, and excuse me if I ask this question every 2 years. I feel like I've heard this
perfectly
before,
understandable.
So we could probably look back at a tape and we had this same conversation. Thank you again for repeating.
Yeah, no problem.
I have a question on growth. Stacy, you might want to stay, just maybe you or someone, I'm not sure. So you're estimating the 6% growth on, people paying their property taxes and things to that effect. Over the last 5-6 years plus, we've seen an exuberant amount of growth in this city. Flat lots being made into 10, 20-story buildings, all increasing property tax and things like that. But we don't see the growth. I don't think we're seeing the same growth in FPD&R members as we are in city property tax percentage-wise, such as this. You're not seeing exponentially growth in the fire and police personnel numbers as you are in the property tax numbers because the growth of the city is growing up. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yep, and that's exactly why the probability has dropped to 1% of exceeding the cap.
Okay.
You've hit the nail on the head, and
Okay.
that's the reason.
And
The
so that's-
numerator is growing more slowly than the
Yep.
denominator is growing.
Yep.
And so it just is a positive effect, or an effect that the fund has, and because we always talk about like the cost of the funds and things of that effect. In actuality, the city is extremely healthy for the number of officers and police that are on or within the board or the fund itself.
Well, I think I think you might be asking a different, are you kind of asking about how many officers and firefighters we have for the population?
Yes.
I mean, that's way outside the realm of my
I'm just saying
expertise.
that the financial health is good or is better now than it was when the city wasn't growing as much.
Yeah, the adequacy, let me put it this way. I don't think I can go quite as far as what you're saying, but the adequacy of the tax levy, which is our funding source for this, is we can be more and more comfortable. We can all breathe easier and easier that the levy is going to be able to provide enough money to fund these benefits. That is mostly because we're getting a lot more room under that 280 cap because real market value is going up and up and up and up. So if the real market value on a property was $500,000, 10 years ago, and it's $1 million now, that 280 per $1,000 real market value, we can get a lot more money out of that property now than we could before. So the costs are going up. The plan is, more and more expensive as we see wage growth and 27 pay dates and, other things happening. But RMV has gone up so much more and I'll talk a little bit about AV rates, assessed value rates, which is how property taxpayers actually pay their property taxes. I mean, those are going up and going to keep going up for a long time. But that cap, that 280 cap, we got more and more breathing room under that.
So then my next question would be is, so we have a number of FPD&R members, an actual number that are in the fund, correct? Is there a way to calculate years ago when we were in a healthy, vibrant number, what number that was as compared to today's? Okay, so I guess my question is this. We have X number of employees in the fund, and we're at a healthy rate, right? The city increases and grows and moves up, but the number never really changes. And yet we're even more healthy, right? The city is. My question is, how many more members could we add to maintain a healthy number under the city?
Depends on, well, first of all, it'd be a little complex to model because we'd have to ask Matt and Scott, hey, let's pretend fire hired 100 people and police added 100 people next year.
That's where I'm going with this question. 'Cause with growth, we need growth, right? And I want to maintain a healthy, vibrant, financially stable fund. And I think if we had that number, that would help in many avenues.
But we have to ask ourselves I'm sorry, Jen.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves two questions. You know, what is the threshold that folks are comfortable with? Is it
Right.
5% chance? Is it 2% chance of exceeding that cap? You know, there's no magic to that. You know, what number do folks feel comfortable about being under that cap? Secondly, what's the impact on what property taxpayers actually pay? Because that is not connected to RMV. That is connected to AV, to assess value growth. So those are two different things, two different questions. If the city were to contemplate adding a significant number, and they did add 50 police officers last year, and so we will start seeing, you know, the effect of that. But if the city wanted to contemplate adding a significant number and the board wanted to pay for an actuarial analysis of that, you know, as part of contract negotiations or something, you could do that. Or we could try to use our new software.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we do have new software, yes. But I think what you're asking is, to what number could $2.80 support?
Right,
And-
or
and
actually
have
less
them
than,
all
because
paid.
I never want to be one on the
Well,
extreme
that-
side, right? I want to be in a healthy, vibrant, financially sound place. But if we are way away from healthy and vibrant, we are exceeding paradise as far as like, we are absolutely 0% chance of any type of failure. Let's move those numbers a little bit more to back our healthy range. What number is that to help? Because in actuality, that supports the city, right? It supports public safety, public wellness, and things like that. So my question is number of bodies, I guess. And I'm not trying to, because I never want to get to any type of financial status where we are in trouble. I want to constrain, but I would like to know we are healthy, and we're even more healthy with the growth of the city. How can we go from more healthy back to healthy?
FPDR is one part of the cost of maintaining a
Right.
dedicated police and fire workforce. So you've answered the question about FPDR's finances and the comfort level of being under the $2.80. Your question, I think, kind of leads more into the city budget question, because can the general fund support the workforce that is in police and fire and pay the salaries separate from the pension and the retirement aspects of it? So there are two parts. One's significantly larger than the other, and that one's more the general fund. This is one component.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make sure that our component was healthy.
I mean, I think the short answer is the levy can bear more staff.
That's what I was.
You know, definitely the levy can bear more staff. It will cost taxpayers more money.
Yeah. Sure.
Because, you know, it will obviously cost more money, but yes, the levy can bear more staff. How many more staff, you know, then that starts to become an actuarial question. My guess is it would far exceed anything council would ever contemplate adding. And in my experience with council around cost discussions at police and fire, FPDR costs are a fairly small part of the decision-making process.
And that's what I was looking for. I wanted to make sure that the fund could host more members. And I get it. It's a very multi-pronged system that I'm looking for here. But I would like us to be stable enough that if we were ever asked, the answer would be yes.
And another thing I can say is certainly I'm not present at all these conversations, probably most of these discussions, but I've never heard a member of city council say we're not adding more police officers and firefighters because we don't think FPDR can afford it.
Yeah.
I have never heard that argument
Correct,
advanced.
and I never want that argument to come up. That's what I was looking for.
And the next time you get your property tax statement, take a look at all the itemized charges that are on there, because the discussion has to include just base property taxes and Portland Public Schools and the water districts and everything else that goes into it. So it becomes a very regional political discussion about the capacity of the population to pay all of those taxes.
And we do cause compression. So every levy, every permanent levy causes compression on every other levy. So every year, we cost the general fund a certain amount of money. We do our budgeting early so the city economist can guess how much we're going to cost his general fund. And then, we cost the county money. And, in turn, they cost us money. And that's why we got to gross it up. It's like a crazy, vicious circle, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but good question. Yeah. Okay,
All right.
thank you for sitting through all that.
Oh, this is it's interesting stuff. So, to fill out my perspective on a question that Trustee Hunziker posted, and I think you did as well, Trustee Cooperman. So this slide 27 here, which shows, there's clear daylight even in the back end of our projection between the, kind of the 5th percentile, which is a bad percentile, and that 280 limit. I've had the opportunity to work with FPDR for about 10 years now, and I'm working a little bit from memory here, but I can definitely remember 2 or 3 studies back when that 5th percentile bar was trespassing above the 280 limit in a couple years. So, in essence, we've got, the core of this, the majority of the costs are for the FPDR2 population, FPDR1, the pay-as-you-go costs. That's a closed group. That group, in terms of the FPDR2, the majority of that cost, that of course has not increased in headcount because it's a closed club. In the 10 years that I've been doing work with them, whereas the RMBs have been very, robust in terms of growth. And so we've got a lot more daylight here and a lot lower probability of this happening than we did, 4, 6, or 8 years ago when I started working with FPDR. So I think last slide of our prepared materials, certainly we showed a lot of different models, volatility, stuff like that, but we didn't model all the potential effects of volatility. We captured certain what we felt like were key items and readily modelable items, but there's other things that could happen. Ms. Jones mentioned, hey, I talked about the correlation between potentially, low inflation and poor investment returns, for PERS, that could, or low RMV growth and poor investment returns for PERS. Those could correlate. A third correlating factor could be in a situation like that, delinquencies go up, and that boosts up the levy ask in terms of a rate. We didn't try to capture that. Of course, the Oregon legislature will do as they will. They'll do the people's business. They could change the property tax laws, and they could change how levies are set, or we could have another taxing authority. You mentioned, Trustee Cooperman, the interconnectedness between, PCC and PPS and urban renewal, this, that, and the other. That can have an effect as well. We could have demographic experience different from assumption. We could have, retiree life expectancy grow or decrease. We could have changes different than we expect in our baseline for FPDR 2-member salaries, even from inflation based on, bargaining agreements, things like that. Growth or changes in the FPDR workforce or changes in the workforce composition. And then, of course, when it comes to the minor contributor to the FPDR2 levy, which is the FPDR3 contribution to Oregon PERS, the Oregon PERS Board has the statutory authority to set assumptions and set funding methodologies as they see fit, and the legislature always has the ability to, if they don't like what the board does, to potentially come in and overrule the board and change different methodologies, and that sort of stuff is beyond the scope. While it's interesting, it's beyond the scope of the analysis that we presented today. So with that, I appreciate everybody's attention on some decidedly wonky stuff, and happy to field any additional questions on this or other matters that the board may have at this time.
I think we decided at a prior board meeting that we're all wonky, and we all kind of like that, so we'll take that as a compliment.
We're all on the spectrum.
Yeah. Right.
I do have one question going back to the valuation results itself. And I apologize because we may have talked about this in our earlier pre-meeting, committee meeting. The assets for the FPDR3 group, I see the liabilities are in here, and I can see the page in the report that sums to the summary, the 3.3 number that you had here 3.3 billion for all three tiers. But I didn't see, for assets, I see 14 or so million or 17 in a reserve fund, and then another in the FPDR fund, and then 750,000 in a reserve fund. Are there assets in PERS set aside that aren't matching against these, and where do those figure in?
So the assets and the liabilities in the FPDR valuation don't include anything related to the Oregon PERS benefits. So we fold Oregon PERS in for the levy modeling here, the contributions to Oregon PERS and the IAP. But in the valuation itself, the only liability you see for FPDR 3 members are their liability for the ancillary, the disability, and those benefits paid out of FPDR. And likewise, there's no separate asset
Okay,
related to Oregon PERS. That's all on the Oregon PERS City of Portland
Report, okay.
report. Yeah.
My reason for looking for that in the first
Yeah.
place, so thanks for clarifying. So this is just really disability and death benefit?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. My reason for looking for that was just to, as you were talking about the amortization schedules paying off in the future, what is, relatively speaking, for, I know PERS Tier 1 and 2 are less well-funded than Tier 3. So relatively speaking, how is the Tier 3 plan or pool in which the FPDR members participate? How stable and well-funded is that tier?
So I'll take a first crack at that, Trustee McLeod. So the FPDR, you're right to note that the OPSERP tier, which is effectively Tier 3 of Oregon PERS, it has a higher funded status than PERS Tier 1 and Tier 2 does. Presently, it's not at 100%. A lot of that, it not being at 100%, isn't particularly down to investment returns. It was down to a decision made by the PERS board about 5 or 6 years ago to change the cost allocation method and the way they calculate the normal cost rate and the accrued liability for PERS. We shifted to a methodology that was going to be consistent with the new requirements for GASB standards. So working from memory, I think that the FPDR, the Tier 3 for PERS OPSERP, I think it sits in the 80 to 90% range.
It may be, or yeah, 70 to 80, but.
Yeah, and then the Tier 1, Tier 2 system with some of the changes in the assumptions, the effect of the Morrow decision by the courts, which increased the liabilities compared to what the legislature had done by about $5 billion, and then the investment returns. So, that fund is closer, at our last published valuation, it was in the 70 to 75% range. With the published valuation results this year, which will be advisory, they won't actually set rates for Portland or other employers. It may go down into the high 60s or something like that.
Okay. So if I heard you right, you were saying somewhere in the 75 to 80% range maybe for Tier 3? So there is some
That sounds right.
meaningful portion of the annual required contribution for that reflects
Right.
catching up from that unfunded
Another way to
portion.
think of
Okay.
it, though, is if you think about the contribution rate, so there's a unfunded liability rate for the Tier 1, Tier 2 part of the program that's levied on all PERS payroll, and that's tied into the 20-year amortization of unfunded pieces. And even on the sort of the step-in collar that's used right now, that may be more than 10% of payroll and growing to 15% or 20%, depending on which group within PERS you're talking about. The OPSERP unfunded charge that amortizes over a 16-year period, over a shorter period, is like 1.5% of payroll. So it's much less significant relative to the size of the PERS contribution than the Tier 1, Tier 2 unfunded. The funded status measurement kind of masks that dynamic.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions for our actuaries? If not, then I'd like to have a motion to accept their report.
I'll move to accept the report.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Great. All in favor to accept the Milliman report, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Great. Thank you for your report.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time
Appreciate
today.
Our next agenda item, Ms. Jones, regarding adopting the fiscal year 1920 budget.
All right. So let me get to my presentation here, which I think requires me, no. No, Kathy, how do I log in? How do I log back in? Is there a password? It's in a CA council? Uh-oh. All Uh-oh, so we may have to take an unplanned, uh-oh. Okay, I'll try going in as myself. I don't know what this is going to do, though. May require significant remapping. How was it turned on before, Kathy? Let's see if that works. While that's loading, we can say really good news on the actuarial valuation front. I mean, the liability dropped, which is mostly just because of the discount rate, so, you know, we can't really have too big of a party. But does mean we'll be dropping a smaller number on the city balance sheet next time. Oh, this might take several minutes, it's telling me. Oh, my goodness. Let's see. And, you know, the drop to the probability of exceeding that cap of 1% from, you know, where we were several years ago is nice to see. Again, it's, you know, all mostly that increase in real market value. And I think Matt and Scott are still here if anybody has any equal to or better than questions that they want to ask. You know, if anybody had anything on their mind.
I do. Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, we'll make Matt and Scott come back up. An excellent stalling technique.
So I see in here in a email from Ms. Jones indicating some clarifications on the equal to or better than. And I noticed in the last testing that the Fpdr had passed on a preliminary determination. A representative sample of the active PERS members will be run through each tier. So why did we pass on that? It says, have we not passed? So I assume we chose to pass on some sort of
Talking
check.
about preliminary determination.
We passed as a positive thing.
Yeah, but had we not passed on it, would it have been
Oh, had we not?
So,
an evaluation?
I'll try to answer your question as best I can. Trustee Hungerson, feel free, obviously, to follow up as appropriate, as needed. So, FPDR in the last testing that was done, which was done as of end of 2008 snapshot date, I think that the report was issued in 2010. FPDR passed because the value of the employer-funded portion of retirement and disability benefits to FPDR members was judged to be equal to or better than that of equivalent PERS members that would have been in the respective tiers. Preliminary determination was a methodology that we detailed in the report that indicated that, you know, on facts and circumstances, FPDR was clearly going to meet the 100% or greater standard. If it was not clear to us that it would have satisfied that standard, then we would have done an additional and more detailed level of testing, running all PERS public safety members as a hypothetical, but a robust hypothetical population, both through the FPDR program provisions and through the Oregon PERS program provisions to have more detailed individual member testing. I will say that one of the reasons that I think FPDR passed on this was a key component of both of the statute that governs that is it focuses on employer-funded portions of the benefits, and member contributions to the FPDR program ceased quite a while ago, I believe in 1990, if I remember right. Whereas the the PERS defined benefit program, tiers 1, 2, and OPSRP, that the member contributions to the DB portion of the program didn't cease till 2003. Those were 6% member contributions, and even if they were picked up by the employers, they were treated as member contributions for the testing methodology under the guiding administrative rules. So they were a pretty significant carve out to get from the total PERS benefit to the employer funded portion of the PERS benefit, which was then tested against FPDR and other employers that have public safety personnel in the state that don't participate in PERS.
Okay. I'm just reading this, and obviously I wasn't here at the time that this test was done in 2010. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So it says, had we not passed, we would have taken it a step further.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Good question. You know, the requirement, the statute for ETOB, my recollection, I mean, it's been modified, you know, a couple times by the legislature, but it's somewhat of a broadly, vaguely worded statute to some extent, and the remedy, could be summarized as fix it, make it better. So that the remedies aren't, completely clear and laid out, but you have to modify the benefits that would be offered to the members if the employer didn't pass to get those benefits to the point that passing would exist. And I'm working, Scott may be flagging me down, that we had one employer, I think, that maybe didn't pass the test last time, and they had the recourse, because you can't say, well, okay, we'd like to just go ahead and retroactively put them into PERS Tier 1. That's not a thing you can do, is that they had to up their benefits to pass the test.
And so what Matt was describing there is accurate for an employer who goes through the full ETOB test and doesn't meet the requirements. That's right. I think part of your question was also the distinction between the preliminary determination and the full test. And so the Oregon PERS Board, which has the statutory requirement to conduct the ETOB test, they worked with interested parties and came up with an administrative rule to govern how the test was going to be done. And then in that process, they said, well, if under the terms of that rule that everyone's kind of weighed in and that the board eventually approved, if under those terms we can look at a given one of these 10 plans and compare them to the tiers in Oregon PERS and know that under this construct of these rules, they will pass, we can document that and not do the further step of more work and more cost to the employer of doing the full test, which is the detailed running 10,000 lives through both programs. So it was only in the context of if it was going to be clear just on the face of what was going to be tested that employer was going to pass, then the PERS board said, okay, you pass and we don't need to do that additional step. So 2 out of the 10 employers passed, including Fpdr, passed on that basis. The other 8 had the full test. If there hadn't been preliminary determination and Fpdr had gone through the full test, they would have passed. And that's why the determination was made. It was obvious that under the rules of the test, it was going to be a passing verdict.
So I think what came before us last meeting was a question of more testing by Fpdr to be tested against a broader scope. Are you guys aware of the details of that? We had a member come forward and ask for that specific request.
Retired number.
Yeah.
I'm somewhat familiar with it, yes.
Yes, and so,
Well, it was so the context of this, first of all, it's really important for us to understand this test, but it is a test and it's defined elsewhere and we have no control over it and you have no control over it. So it's good to have this documented and I really appreciate the time you put into doing that. The context of why we were raising these questions before is because a member at the last meeting came forward and was, I think, stating a desired goal of creating a disability retirement, category, as opposed to a service retirement under Fpdr. And it was our understanding that there is no formal disability retirement under this plan. There's disability and there's service retirement, but there's, unlike PERS where there's a disability retirement, there is no such thing under Fpdr. And as part of his goal to see how the possibility of making that happen, he was going to use the equal to or better than test as a methodology, saying we didn't really meet that test or it wasn't adequately prepared. So I think there were some challenges in his mind to doing that and thinking that might be a road to getting this disability retirement in there. I think we've come to realize that the test is the test and there's no doing it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that as a board, we could explore further what some other testing might be to indicate whether or not there's some gaps in some desired coverage. Obviously, filling that gap is way out of our control. I mean, that's a city charter thing, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't explore our thoughts about that and that the organization couldn't and push that forward. And I think we've got some interest, in pushing and looking at that a little bit further. So that's the context, I think, of where this came up. In my mind, the 3 things that were summarized here that stood out to me where maybe what might be interesting to know a little bit more about this plan would be, as far as this test goes, service retirement and disability retirement are considered separately, and under that, the equal to or better than must be at least 80% of the value of a similar PERS benefit. Well, what happens if there is no disability retirement in Fpdr? How is that tested if one is 0 and the other is something? It seems to me that that's an automatic failure of that little branch. I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Appreciate the thoughts on this and the comments, Trustee McLeod. So start from the front of those, is it's important, and so we're aware of the considerations and the questions that were raised on this in terms of the council, and the comment we'd provide on that is it's important to recognize that the ETOB testing is ultimately governed by, in my view, two entities. I mean, we conduct the testing for the retained actuaries for PERS. It's governed by the statute, illustrated by the administrative rule, and the statutory body that holds the authority to conduct the test is the PERS board. So, comments and questions about the test, and like we think the test should be done differently or have this, it's either change the statute or change the governing administrative rule, and that works either through the legislature or the PERS board. That's something for an interested party to be cognizant of. It's been a while since I've looked at the disability retirement issue, so I'm not sure that I'd be prepared to comment on that one. And, kind of the technical question about, is there no disability retirement benefit? How does that satisfy or fail to satisfy ETOB?
And fair enough. I mean, you just walk back up to kind of take these questions, ad hoc. So we're not expecting anything, but it did occur to me that might be one aspect of the specific test worth exploring. So I might like some feedback about that.
Sure.
And thanks for commenting about that. The other, another area was that the test, as written, and under the control of those two organizations, as you just identified, compares benefits for active employees
Correct.
and not retirees. And obviously, FPDR 1 and 2 are heavily retirees, and whether there's implications for that, and as a plan, it might make sense to explore that further outside of the realm of passage of this test. Is there an adequacy or an inadequacy of benefits in an area, if you're looking at retirees only, that would be worthy of consideration? So I just raised that question. And then the last is the tax advantages of the benefits. Disability is not taxed, and retirement benefits are taxed. So just wondering whether any of those three areas maybe would be something that as a group we might want to explore further.
I agree with Trustee McLeod. So some of these issues, these are concerns that we're trying to move forward on to be a more, and I think all of us would want to be active. We want to be proactive and request by our members. We're voted and appointed to these positions for those reasons. So with those issues that Trustee McLeod spoke of, is that something you guys could enter or give information on, or not to speak lightly of the company, or you're not the company that we want to look at? I mean, do we want to look outside sources? I mean, what's your thought on that?
It's a tricky question, given that we also serve as the retained actuaries for the PERS board, which creates a little bit of a challenge for us in that regard. So, I mean, our general counsel would be that to study up on the governing statute, the governing rule, and kind of do your own from your own perspective, and representing the folks that you represent, to do your own kind of independent critique of it, and seek guidance or pose questions of us in the role that we serve both as the FPDR and the PERS actuary, or from other parties as you see fit. And I will say that I think PERS statement I'll make from the work that we've done with PERS for the past 12 or 13 years. PERS is an agency. It's been historically for the past decade or so has been very pro-transparency. So, we want to kind of show our work and have folks understand the rules, understand the mechanics, and not have any surprises.
I 100% agree, and I think that's what we're trying to do too. We want to make sure that we're answering questions that are brought to us in as most honest and appropriate way possible. Okay.
I mean, I do want to say that, so I think it's what I want, what I think everyone understands is, we have not failed, nor are we likely to ever fail an ETOP test. So the ETOP test is not the mechanism for anything related to this conversation. So I think now what you guys are talking about is plan design and plan change.
Right.
And that is a different matter. So then we would be saying, all right, we would like to add this benefit. We know that we passed the ETOP test, it has nothing to do with it. But we might like to add some sort of benefit, and then that's a charter change process, and part of that would be a financial analysis, and part of that we might retain actuaries to do, or we might not, depending on if it's something we can handle in-house. And in that case, I think there's no conflict with using Milliman, because we're not talking about ETOP, we're just talking about plan, and we have used Milliman to cost plan design changes on previous charter changes. So that's what we're talking about, is plan redesign with a charter referendum. then we would want to look at the financial analysis.
So something like, if I could just chime in, a direction like that, I would hope is a unanimous direction that we as a council are able to give FPDNR. We're down a member, we're talking about it sort of ad hoc right now. I don't want you, Milliman, to walk away thinking that we're giving you specific direction today to go do something, because we're just talking. But if there is interest in amending plan design, we should do it with Sam, with Stacy, and look at what.
And with our commissioner in charge, because.
Yeah, just amongst ourselves first, then it does need to go through the council. We do have a new commissioner in charge. We would want to check in and see the direction, the political appetite and direction that she has for the board, for the plan at this particular time. Something like that would have to be a charter change, which is a big lift. I've never been through that. I remember voting on it when I first moved here. But there's a lot to be done behind the scenes, so I want to manage people's expectations.
Yeah, fairly done. And again, I just wanted to put this, the context of why the questions about this equal to or better than came up, and to agree exactly with what you said, Stacy, that there isn't a doubt in my mind at least that the test was passed, the test methodology is well understood, and there don't seem to be gaps there. It is what it is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if we were to compare, the benefit of having a test, whether it's the precise equal to or better than test is written in the law or something similar to it that serves as a framework for saying, what would a proposed change? How might that stack up against other agencies' plans, et cetera? That's really the context of doing that. And so it's just the beginning of a long and perhaps complex process. And yes, your points are well taken that we need to all be in agreement before we get too much further.
I fully agree.
We're talking.
Exploring, yeah.
I really haven't talked on it yet, so I just wanted to, maybe I should have had this question 10 minutes ago, but I'm going to ask it now. So when you started talking about the ETOB, you talked about the preliminary determination, and then I've heard you say it a couple times about the employee portion and the employer portion. So it's no secret that we don't pay a portion, but we did pay a portion at some time, and it was bargained through the contract to take a lower COLA in lieu of making your contribution. And PERS pretty much does the same thing in different jurisdictions. They all do things differently. So knowing that, to make the determination with that information, I feel like I'm missing something. Because if we were basing it on, well, since FPDR people don't pay, and PERS people do pay, even though some of them don't, and saying, well, that's the reason why we got a preliminary determination, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. I figured you would have taken that into consideration, but then done the math and said, did we really pass on predetermination based on if we were paying and they were paying, and then do we move forward? Did you do that analysis?
So to answer your concern, Trustee Lehman, that when we conducted the analysis, we were aware of all the factors, cognizant both that there was a contributory period of time for FPDR1, which I believe ran up through 1990, and then the contributory period of time for Oregon PERS for the defined benefit program, which ran up through 2003. And in terms of making our assessment of that, we were documented that, and we were certainly contemplative of the timing of those contributions being made and their relative overall contribution to the funding of the overall total benefit. It would be a higher percentage that would have been funded given the current active population that was, in 2008. You had some, but not, a majority perhaps of FPDR members at that time that would have made some contributions for some portion of their career. And we were very contemplative of the facts and circumstances and the relative timings of each of the respective programs in making the determination.
But in response to your question about did we look at it both ways, if it did count or didn't count for the contribution, the answer to that is no. The rule made it clear how the contributions were going to be tested.
Yeah.
And so the preliminary determination was entirely in that light of saying, given the way the contributions are going to be handled, that's what we have to look at for that first step of the test. And if there's a concern that the way the contributions are handled and written in the board rule that to change that would be a rulemaking process for the Oregon PERS Board. But there wasn't any step in our process of looking, what if the rule was written 2 or 3 different ways, and how would the results have changed? It was in the context of the testing rule.
It didn't seem,
Did that not answer?
go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Can I just clarify, is your question that if PERS employees are, because to contribute 6%, but if PDNR doesn't, but in reality, some agencies bargain so
out
that the
PER,
employer
yeah.
picks up the 6% or half of it, your question is, how does that relate?
yeah,
Right?
you said like,
Right.
it's
And-
only the way
Yeah.
it's written, but did you have the opportunity to, I mean, do you have to give the preliminary determination? Or can you say, something's a little wonky here, let's do the test, because this isn't apples to apples. It might say in the rules, if this matches up to this, then you can give the preliminary determination, but does it say you have to?
No, we don't have to give a preliminary determination, but given the way the rule was written and is written, it was clear that the contribution for Tier 1 and Tier 2 members up through 2003, whether it was picked up by an employer or not, is considered a member contribution and would be carved out from the value in the way that test is done. So we knew that when we were looking at it for that preliminary determination step.
And the FPDR contributions made up through the period of time would have been carved out as well under the same rule.
Only actual contributions.
Yeah,
not-
Yeah, so for
contributions, right, yes.
FPDR2
Not a-
wouldn't have
Right,
been applied.
Yes, that.
And it would be my understanding that
Yep.
that's the relative nature of the plan benefits being provided. If an individual agency or participating employer were then to negotiate with its bargaining groups to pick up part of that,
Yeah.
that's a trade-off that's between them. So that really does seem out of the context of the test that they would be doing. So, that's like, FBD&R members giving up, COLA in exchange for something else. You're bargaining that away, and then the remaining plan is what gets tested, not, so,
But some of those were just a pass-through. There was no give or take. It was just, I pay it today, you pay it tomorrow with a wash. But it looks more beneficial on our side because we're not making a contribution. And some of those organizations, they were making a contribution, and then now the employer picks it up, but the employee got a raise that matched it. So it's not a wash, and we're doing the same thing as an employee, but it appears that they're contributing. So that's what I'm saying, when you're using that as the determination of the predetermination, and that was like the biggest factor, I don't think it should be. I think that we should maybe look at other things or go to the full test if that's the factor. If there was
But-
something else going on, that you guys made that decision, or the decision was made, a bunch of other stuff, I could see it, but you've brought that up a couple times, and as that being the factor why you decided to give the predetermination.
So,
I was just going to say that's not the only reason.
Yeah.
And it's correct to say, just for some context, I think, so FPDR ones paid 7% of their salary up through June of 1990, and PERS members 6%. Is that right? Was it 6% back then?
through 2003.
Through 2003. So just to have in your mind as a comparative point, 7% through 1990, 6% through 2003 on the PERS side. Although, like, as you say, Jason, it doesn't address the point of whether the employer actually pays the employee contribution, because you treat that 6% as an employee contribution irrespective of whether the employer picks it up.
Under the guiding administrative rules of the test, and just to help respond to your expressed concern, Trustee Lehman, I certainly mentioned this employer-paid portion and kind of the treatment of employee contributions, whether they're picked up or otherwise, and some of the additional nuances you pointed out about kind of the gives and takes that can go with bargaining agreements. I'm not pointing that out and highlighting it a couple times because that would be the primary driver that FPDR passed the test. It's just that I think it's a highly visible, highly contentious, and challenging issue. The bigger reason that we made the decision to do when we conducted the test under the rules back in 2009, 2010 to do the preliminary determination, it was more about the overall level of benefits. The overall level of benefits contemplative of the multipliers, the features, the pay averaging periods is cognizant of the different definitions of pay that were used in the plan. So it was one factor, but I wouldn't characterize it as the primary or driving factor for the determination that was made.
And I think all those things you mentioned they're not apples to apples either as far as multipliers, because then base pay comes in and
Yes.
averaged over 3 years or one, or some include overtime, some
Correct.
don't. So I don't think any of that is cut and dried. So I just think the more I hear about it, I think, unless I saw the information that was glaringly predetermination is
Yeah.
the way to go. It sounds to me like maybe we should have went to a full test, and I'm just basing that off of some information I'm getting here. But I think when we get to this or ever get to it again, I want to make sure that we're involved in the process, that we get to see the information. I don't know how that works, who was involved in those conversations, if the board was involved, or who was involved when you decide on an equal to or better than, and if it's presented to the board, and then we get to ask these questions prior to a determination or a decision is made on the equal to or better than.
And again, we just have to remember that this is a PERS test, and PERS couldn't care less how we want the test to be done. It might be possible in 2022 I mean, really, we cut the check, we give them the data they asked for, the end. That is the absolute end of our involvement in the ETOP test. The results are not presented to the FPDR board because they were not prepared for the FPDR board. They're presented to PERS. Now, none of that is to say that when our next test happens in 2022, we could, again, say, hey, Milliman, we want to run through the whole test, and we're willing to pay for it. They're not going to do that as something they're doing for PERS. They have to follow the PERS rules. But perhaps they could, for an extra cost to FPDR, run through the whole test, maybe.
Well, and one comment to partially address another concern you raised, Trustee Lehman, is the last preliminary determination report, which was done, conducted, published in 2010, we tried to be both cognizant of the governing administrative rule, the governing statute, and show our work. So some of those key issues, which are absolutely vital, what constitutes a member contribution versus what doesn't constitute a member contribution? How do the benefit multipliers differ? How do the forms of benefit differ? What's included in pay? How is overtime treated? Even though it's a preliminary determination, each of those key factors is laid out in our certified report on that, so that it's kind of there in one table side by side, and it forms the basis for the judgment that we made.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Stacy figured out her password, so we're very happy for her.
That gave me a long transition time.
Password filler.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you to Matt and Scott, who are so knowledgeable about so many things, and mostly delivering good news from the actuary. So are you guys ready for budget now?
Yes.
Whew, 1920 budget. All right, I couldn't get it back up, and it's doing that PDF in Microsoft Edge business, but we'll soldier on. So once again, I'm Stacey Jones, the FPDR Finance Manager, and we're going to talk about next year's budget and the 5-year forecast. Stop me anytime to ask questions. I just want to talk about the process a little bit. FPDR is the only bureau for which council does not have budget authority. So the FPDR board has exclusive authority to adopt the FPDR budget. Council is required in city charter to levy a tax sufficient to fund that budget. The buck stops with you guys. We do go through the whole city budget process because we are included in the city budget that the mayor will propose at the end of April, and we're included in the budget that council will adopt in June. So we go through that whole process. Whatever you guys approve today, we will turn into council and the city budget office on February 4th. So budget timing is an issue every year because we're trying to get materials out to you guys in mid-January, and the rest of the city's working towards a February 4th deadline. So that's why you only got this a week in advance. I know you've come to expect all your other materials 2 weeks in advance, but even 1 week in advance, for example, when I sent this out to you, I didn't know the actual COLA on July 1. We hadn't locked down interagency expenses. The deadline for that was last Friday. So timing is always a little bit rough coming to you guys a couple of weeks before the rest of the city is wrapped up because we have so many points of intersection, particularly with police and fire. But this year it's even crazier because we have a completely new budget process with the city, and we have new budget software. So, that's awesome to do those twice. If you look in so things are a little more, not to do them twice, but to do those both simultaneously. So let me talk about what you have in your book. You have your presentation, which looks very similar to how it's looked for the last year or two. After that, you have the 5-year forecast, and that does look different. And that's because in the past, every non-general fund bureau kind of did their own forecast based on whatever they wanted to do, and they are standardizing that across the city. So this is in the new standardized format. It doesn't look how it will look in the actual report because the software isn't kicking that report out yet. So I kind of mocked it up in Word for you guys. And then beyond that, our program offers. I thought there might be some curiosity about this. The new city budget process is that bureaus are offering council programs, sort of like I'm the Parks Bureau and we're offering to provide swim lessons and this is how much it would cost. It doesn't fit with FPDR that well because we have to provide these programs and they cost what they cost. But I thought there might be some curiosity to see the budget in that program offer structure. So you'll see those program offer reports for each of our 4 main programs. If you're curious, again, those reports weren't quite ready for prime time when I had to print them. There's formatting issues with performance measures and things like that. But anyway, you have them if you want to look at them. So let's launch into it and start talking about the budget. So let's do kind of the 30,000 foot level before we get into all of the exciting nitty gritty. If I had to describe our budget in one sentence, I would say we spend almost all of our money on pensions and we get almost all of our money from property tax revenues. And, I could almost leave it at that, and you'd probably be grateful if I did. But what would you do with the next hour of your life? Like, get coffee? But that is it in a nutshell. So let's start with expenses, which is a little backwards. If you're a budget person, you first usually think about how much money you have and how you're going to spend it. We do it backwards at FPDR. We say, how much money do we need? We must provide these benefits. How much is that going to cost? And then we figure out how to get the money that we need, which is from the property tax payment. So our total budget, less tax anticipation notes for 1920 that we are recommending to the board is about $178 million, and this is it broken out into its components. You'll recall that we often strip tax anticipation notes out because we issue them in one year and repay them in the same fiscal year. So counting them just sort of double counts everything. I think most of these categories are self-explanatory. Fund level expenses might be a little confusing. Somebody the other day said, are you talking about flood level expenses? No, not flood level, fund level. So these are expenses that if you live in your own fund, as we do, you have to have contingency. You have to pay general fund overhead. There are expenses that you have if you run your own fund, and that's where those go. Most of that is contingency. About $11.5 million of that is just fund contingency.
So Milliman's bill, for example, is an administrative expense?
Yes, Milliman's bill is an administrative expenses, yes. So, and I'll talk in a lot more detail about what is in all of these categories, but this gives you that big snapshot. The important thing to say is that charter-defined benefits make up about 90% of our expenses, and most of the remainder is fund contingency. So unlike, if you're sitting on council listening to the Parks Bureau budget, there's not a lot of policy choices. This is mostly making sure we got the methodology right for projecting the budget. Stop me anytime if you have questions. Moving on to revenues. As you can see, as I said before, they're almost all property taxes. And if you consider that beginning fund balance is essentially leftover property taxes from a prior year, then about 98% of our fund resources are property taxes. We do have some interagency revenues coming in. I don't know if you all remember, those come from police and fire, mostly, almost all police. When police officers go and do secondary work, primarily for TriMet, but also for a lot of organizations. Those third-party organizations give the Bureau's money to cover wages and benefits of the employees and an overhead rate that includes a portion for pension and disability, and that portion gets passed on to us. In that other category, that is mostly interest income. About $1.8 million of that is interest income on fund balance and a transfer from the reserve fund of $750,000, $750,000 that we always budget but rarely need. We just want to have it if we need it. So this is, I promise this is the only time I'm going to show you a table with a bunch of little tiny numbers on it. This is like what you guys have to do today. Look at a lot of tables with very small numbers. So this is the entire 5-year forecast. So let me talk for a minute about 5-year forecasting. So in addition to putting together the budget for next year, the city requires that everybody who runs their own fund puts together a 5-year forecast. It's an excellent practice. I think it makes the city stand out for it's an excellent financial practice. Forces everybody to think through what's coming up over the next 5 years. I mean, I wish I did this at home in my own home budget. So you'll see at the top of the chart our resources here. I did it the right way and put revenues on top. And then requirements, expenses down below. You see they match. That's the minimum requirement of the budget office, is that those two things match. And then you'll see the amount net of tax anticipation notes running along the bottom there. I've given you 1 year of actuals, the current year budget, current year projected spending, because it'll, now we're partway through the year, it's a little different than we budgeted. Budget for next year, and then 4 years of forecast. And then the percentage change from the projected spending in the current year to the end of the forecast. So with tax anticipation notes thrown in there, it's about 50% growth over the 5 years. With tax anticipation notes thrown out, it's about 38% growth, which is to be expected, about to be expected, given that we are funding 2 generations of pensions simultaneously and kind of still ramping up into those double up years. It looks very similar to last year in that sense.
Why do fund level requirements grow so fast?
Tax anticipation notes. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about TANs, but TANs, we budget them as 4.5 months of fund expenses. So as expenses grow, they keep growing and growing and growing. Also contingency is growing because again, it's a percent of bureau requirements. And so we just get like that effect on all of the categories and the 2 major categories in fund level requirements. And you don't, once you strip out TANs, you don't see near as much growth, but all of that extra growth is really coming from those tax anticipation notes.
Your actual in 2018 was 142.49. What was your projection? What was last year's tab on that projection?
For fiscal year 18, what was our projection compared to actuals? I'd have to go back and look. I know that we underspent our pension budget last year. That was the only really significant thing. We projected to spend more on pensions than we actually spent. We keep having fewer retirements than we expect.
Again, it goes back to my question before, is the city is growing exponentially, and property taxes, I believe, are going to have an exponential growth as compared to fund costs, because our fund is generally the same size. Other than percentage growth, it's not like we're adding 50 firefighters and 50 cops every other year. But property taxes, I'm just curious, actual versus.
Oh, well, so property taxes, the way this works that is weird is that we go out and levy whatever we need in property taxes. So property taxes just grow exactly in step.
What we need, okay.
With expenses, they're literally a plug for us at the very end. We figure everything else out, put in our little bit of extra revenue and say, what do we need? We need 130 million, plop, 130 million in property taxes.
Thank you.
And the fund is growing, expenditures are growing and will grow exponentially for the next 15 years or so as we kind of get to that peak moment I keep talking ad nauseum about, and the actuaries as well. Any other questions about this chart? Okay. We can always come back if you think of more. Also, before we get too much into the detail, it's just easy to lose sight of the main sort of background story of the budget as we start, being in the weeds a little bit on particular budgets. I think these are the 3 takeaways to keep in mind as we think about the budget. And we keep saying this, but costs are growing because they're supposed to. We're transitioning from a pay-as-you-go plan to a pre-funded plan, and that means we have to double up for a whole generation. So costs are going to keep increasing for the next 15 to 20 years. Then they will start to slowly decline over the next 30, 35 years, and then they'll kind of level out at that bottom. So we have really quite dramatic growth, and we're going to see that every single year until we're all retired. Future generations will benefit from that transition. PERS contributions are an increasing part of our budget, and they are changing what I guess I would call the rhythm of the budget. We're increasingly exposed to changes in PERS rates, which is another way of saying we're increasingly exposed to macroeconomic forces as those rates change. We also care a lot more about retirement rates and wage increases. Hiring rates and wage increases than we used to. In the direct pay plans, we really focused on retirement rates because we're creating new retirees, and mortality rates. Folks are passing away. But in the Fpdr 3 plan, we really care about new hires because we start paying PERS contributions on them 6 months after we hire them. Whereas before, we cared about it, but we weren't going to see any costs for 25 years. Now we're going to see costs within 6 months. And wage increases, same thing. When a wage increase happens now, we see that immediately. We're making PERS contributions on wages right now, whereas before, we saw the impact in higher final pay for new retirees, but it kind of bled into the plan slowly over many years. So the immediacy of the impact of hiring and pay increases, we're starting to feel that in our budget. And the other thing is that PERS contribution rate changes, they happen every 2 years, so it creates kind of a bumpiness in the budget that you get these big changes every other year instead of a smooth thing, which when you're trying to manage a tax levy and cognizant of not wanting to have big spikes is something to think about. The last sort of takeaway is I don't want to lose sight of disability costs, although they're a small portion of the budget, but that they have fallen in 7 of the 8 years after the 2006 reforms. And I think, but we knew that would be asymptotic. They can't decline for forever. And I think that we've kind of seen that they have stabilized now at that lower level and are now, we're projecting, are just going to grow in general with medical inflation and wage inflation, although disability benefits are very volatile. So they're going to bounce around. But if you do a trend line, I think we're looking at least that's what we've assumed in this forecast, is that we're just going to steady as she goes on disability benefits, no additional declines.
I'm going to ask you why you only went 8 years after 2006 on that one?
Because that's the point that it kind of leveled out.
Oh, okay, and then the 3 years are over here. Okay, so
Yeah.
and after that, it's just
It's
stayed the
been,
same.
it's been essentially the same. I mean, it bounces around, like I said, it's volatile, but if you just draw a trend line through it, it's leveled out. So we weren't sure for those first couple of years, has it really leveled out? It seems like it's really leveled out at this point. So things that are new this year, I mean, I kind of talk about the same trends every year, the same things that are happening. So it's kind of fun to highlight what's different, although none of this is really earth-shattering. I've been saying that property taxes normally move with expenses, and this year that is actually not really happening. We're only going to grow our property tax request by 1% over the current year, even though we have expenditure growth of over 8%. And that is because we are going to have more money this year that we can use and not need to go ask taxpayers for next year. Part of that is the Comcast property tax payment that I mentioned at the last board meeting. We got $3 million from Comcast. And we're projecting right now that we'll have about $3 million in underspending on the pension budget. Again, fewer folks retiring. So that's $6 million that we don't need to go ask taxpayers for next year, that we'll be able to use next year. Also, that Comcast payment raises the current year, raises the denominator in that comparison of growth. So we're having relatively low property tax growth for next year. We have an unusual degree of uncertainty in the Fpdr personnel budget. I mean, this is not something I talk about a lot. It's a very small part of our budget, about 1.5%. But 13 of Fpdr's 17 employees are non-represented, and the city this year has rolled out a new non-represented compensation and classification system. And it is also implementing the state of Oregon's pay equity law, which, as I understand it, is one of the most expansive in the country, or perhaps the most expansive. And as part of both of those, has rolled out a new merit raise and hiring offer system. So we have a lot of uncertainty about what that means going forward. So we've budgeted very conservatively, I think much more than we will actually need for the personnel budget. But the personnel budget is usually relatively stable, and we have some uncertainty for things that are beyond our control for that next year. And we are budgeting TANs a little bit different. This is a little wonky, but hey, Jennifer says you guys like wonky. You guys like wonky things. If you go back and you look at actuals, you will see that every year we budget way more for TANs than we actually end up issuing. And the methodology since time immemorial has been 4.5 months of expenses. We got to get from July 1 to November 15th when we get our taxes. That's what we're going to put in the budget. Now, in reality, we size it based on a pretty complex cash flow analysis, and of course we have money. We don't start July 1 with $0 in the bank. And we have other revenues, and there are expenses that don't necessarily hit in those 4.5 months. So there's grown to be a pretty big gap between what's budgeted and what we actually issue. From one point of view, it doesn't really matter. It's sort of money in, money out. But at another point of view, if a normal person were to look at our budget, there is a big gap between those. So tried to narrow the gap a little bit, and we're going to do 4.5 months of expenses minus beginning fund balance, projected beginning fund balance, and revenues that we expect to take in. And we are not putting every expense we can dream of in those first 4.5 months. We're trying to be a little more realistic about that. But while still being conservative, because we issue TANs in July, and there's no time to get a budget adjustment from anybody before we go issue them. So we don't ever want to not have enough authority to get all the money that we need from the market. So those are some things that are different this year. So I'm going to talk through the budget in each of its components, and we will start with the big one, which is direct pension benefits to FPDR 1s and 2s. Just this piece is about 3/4 of our budget. And this budget is a 4-variable guessing game. How many are coming in? That's new retirements. How many are going out? That's deaths. What are the pension amounts for the new retirees, and what kind of cost of living adjustments are we giving existing retirees? There are other things, like how many of our members who pass away have spouses, and what kind of surviving benefit did they leave? And I mean, there are other things, but those are the 4 main things. Retirement rates, historically we use an actuarial projection. So Milliman does experience studies periodically, and we apply a probability to every retirement eligible member in each year of the forecast based on their experience study. So we give everybody this probability of retiring. And then we tend to mess with it a little bit in the first year, in the current year, because how many people retire this year has the biggest impact for next year's budget. We have not messed with it this year. We did not add a cushion. Just actuarially, we get 23 fire retirees and 30 police retirees, just applying those actuarial probabilities this year, and we think that's more than enough. But this year, we also have the luxury of the retirements are mostly going to happen in February and March, because that's when the 27 pay date months is. And if we're wrong, then we can adjust the budget in April or May and come back to it. So we have not added cushions this year as we normally do. For people out, that's purely actuarial. We give everybody, I hate to say this in a public forum, but we give everybody a probability of death in every single year, every member, and apply that and come up with, a number of people that we expect to see retire, and just use average benefit amounts to guess about how many folks are going to flow out of the system. I mean, if you're curious, on average, we assume that male retirees pass away at about 87.5, and female surviving spouses pass away at about 90.5, because for now, those are the demographics of the population. And then we estimate the pension amounts for the new retirees. We look at the eligible pool of folks who are eligible to retire and do a lot of very highly detailed analyses that are still wrong, but we go through it and we do the best we can to try to estimate how much those will be. For cost of living adjustments, FPDR 1s, we've assumed we'll get the same wage increases that we're projecting for the active population, and FPDR 2s, we assume the board chooses to continue to use the modified PERS method. You don't have to, but that's what we assume for the budget. So all of that results in the 5.7% growth in the pension budget, which is in line with what we've seen the last several years. We've seen growth in that 5 to 6% place. That's mostly because FPDR 2s, with their more generous benefit, are replacing FPDR 1s. We're down to about 400 FPDR 1s right now as of January, and we have a little over 1,500 FPDR 2 beneficiaries, so that gives you a sense of the split. But higher final pay is also playing a role. We had a high wage COLA last year. We are going to have another high wage COLA this year and project another high one after that, plus those 3% raises at police, plus 27 pay dates. All those things are playing a role. I like to talk about retirements as we transition between talking about FPDR 1 and 2 pension costs to talking about FPDR 3 expenses, because this impacts both. When FPDR 2s retire, that drives up our FPDR 1 and 2 pension costs, and that means we have to hire new folks, and that drives up our FPDR 3 costs. So this chart shows you 10 years of actual retirements, a projection for the current year, projection for the budget year next year, and then a projection for the 4 years after that. You can see how volatile it is. We've had as few as 20 folks retire. We've had as many as, as many as 85 retire in any given year. Very volatile, very hard to predict. Has stabilized a little bit over the last 4 years in the 50 to 70 zone, and we are more or less predicting that will continue for the next 4 years until you get out to the last year of the forecast, when we suddenly have a lot of folks become eligible to retire. We've been having 60 folks or so become newly eligible every year, In that year, we have about 90, so hiring bump somewhere. I haven't analyzed it to see if it was police or fire, or perhaps both at that point. You will also see that in the current year, in 18-19, we have more folks projected to retire then, and that, I keep calling that the actuarial pileup, which makes it sound like a traffic accident. But we have quite a few folks, particularly at fire, that using our actuarial experience, we've applied a 100% probability that they'll retire this year because they're so far outside the norm for age and years of service. So they're sort of piled up there. Now, will all those folks actually retire this year, even though we say 100% they're going to retire? No, not all of them will. But we do have quite a few of those. We have 4 active members over 65. 3 of them are at police. We have 19 active members over 60. Most of those are at fire. 3 of the 4 over 65 are at fire. So there's that actuarial pileup, and it's mostly at fire, and we'll see what happens as we get to the end of the year. All right, FPDR 3 pension contributions. This is the fastest growing part of the budget, and it's supposed to be. The biggest story here is the growing number of FPDR 3 members. Matt and Scott were mentioning we're actually at about 40% of the sworn workforce is FPDR 3, and we actually predict that at the end of the 5-year forecast, about 2/3 of the sworn workforce will be FPDR 3. So we're seeing lots and lots more members as folks retire, and also we had the new police officers added last year by council. But the second biggest story is increasing PERS rates, which I'm sure you've heard and read a lot about. We care about the Tier 3 OPSERP public safety rates, and there are lots of different rates, but that's the rate we care about. And it's going from 24.46% this year to 29.16% next year, and then it will stay the same for 2 years. And after that, we have a projection that it'll go to 34%, and then in the last year of the forecast, it'll go to 38%. Those are the city economists' projection. Those do not reflect low returns in the PERS investment portfolio for 2018, so certainly the rates for the next 2 years are set. We know them. But beyond that, it's certainly possible that it could be even higher than the 34% in those out years.
What's the factors that could decrease or increase that 38%?
What are the factors that could increase it? Essentially PERS investment returns. If the PERS board decides to lower the assumed earnings rate again, as Matt was discussing, that will drive down the funded status of PERS, and that will increase contribution rates. And we could get super wonky on this and talk about the rate collaring that happens at PERS. When PERS funded status dips below 70%, these sort of restrictions they have on how much you can increase the rates in any given biennium, those restrictions come off. And I think they come off in 2 levels, if I remember right, like one at 70% and one at 60%. In any event, so you get the potential for more exponential rate growth if those collars come off, if the funded status of the plan drops below a certain level, which is primarily dependent on investment returns, but also dependent on the assumed earnings rate that the board adopts, which is used to value the funded status of the plan.
If the returns increase, they might think twice about lowering, so.
Right, and so it'll be interesting to see, what the returns are. We know 2018 was not good, but we'll see what 2019, looks
Okay,
like,
thank
and
you.
we'll get to see that. Yeah, you can see, we're increasingly vulnerable to that, although there is nothing we can do about it. The rates are what they are, or at least nothing I can do about it. The third factor here is wage growth. We've talked a little bit about that, but particularly impactful are larger than usual cost of living adjustments and those series of 3% increases at police. And something we are starting to see a different flavor of wage growth is promotions in both bureaus. So we now have, we have 25 above the rank of firefighter at fire and 24 above the rank of officer at police in this FPDR 3 pool. So as they age in, they're going to, and of course our police chief is an FPDR 3 member, but we're going to see them spreading through the ranks, which is another form of wage growth and a hard one to model, but we're kind of having fun with the police and fire finance staff. Really wonky fun in modeling how those promotions play out as this population ages in. So we've already talked about the impacts of FPDR 3 pension contributions playing a bigger role in our budget. That exposure to the PERS contribution rates that immediacy of feeling hiring decisions and the immediacy of wage increases hitting the budget, and also that every other year bumpiness that you get with the PERS rates. And we'll see that more and more. Disability and death benefits. Over to the right, you will see kind of the 5 different components of disability benefits, and 1 year of actuals, projection for the current year, and then projection for the budget year, and the other 4 years of the forecast. As we have said, we are mostly predicting that this bottoms out. You can see that medical payments, which are the biggest item, that's the top blue line, are still growing pretty steadily, and that's because we are growing that with medical inflation, which is higher than everything else. Not as high as you might think. We're using 4%, which is the 5-year average of the CPI West areas for medical costs. Plus, we threw in a little extra for cushion because we get nervous that medical inflation will be higher than it has been historically. But the rest of the costs are essentially, kind of steady as you go. We assume folks on long-term disability stay there until they retire, and that we add a couple every year. It's based on plan experience. We assume short-term disability stays the same. This, again, is very volatile, but that on average, the size of the number of folks on short-term disability and the rank, therefore the pay of the folks on short-term disability stays roughly the same. So that means the biggest drivers of this are wage inflation, because we're paying wage replacement benefits to folks, and medical inflation for the medical component. And we do not have large claim insurance or anything like that, but we do have a healthy contingency to handle any size of claim, I believe. And funeral benefits down there at the very, very bottom, they're small, but they're kind of interesting. They're the only piece that are growing quickly, and that's because the FPDR 2 funeral benefit is half of a month's pay, and the FPDR 1 funeral benefit is only $200. So as we start to see more FPDR 2s pass away, that'll grow. Administrative expenses. So this is, the only really, and I hate to say really, discretionary part of the FPDR budget, because it is not charter defined, benefit driven. But even administrative expenses are maybe primarily or half outside of bureau and board control. You can see the pieces here. Personnel is the largest piece by a little bit. And personnel salary ranges and annual cost of living adjustments are set centrally by the city. Merit raise policies are set centrally by the city. What is within board and bureau control is how many folks we have and at what position. We have 17, ranging from an office support specialist at the front desk to the director. Health benefits are set centrally by the city. PERS rates are set centrally. So a lot of personnel costs are not really discretionary. Rates for internal materials and services, those are things we buy from other city bureaus in blue. Those rates are set internally within certain constraints. What we can control is how much, to some degree, we can control how much of what things we buy. External materials and services up in red. This is the most discretionary piece, although even there, the biggest expense in that category is rent. And we're in the middle of a lease, so not a whole lot of discretion there. If you're curious, the biggest expense in internal materials and services is the city attorney's office, what we pay for their expertise. And then that last little slice is spending on the database, the FPDR database, which is capital spending, since it's an intangible capital asset. The administrative, so here's a look at just how costs are rising in the administrative budget, and they are rising much more than usual this year, going up to $4 million for the budget next year, which is almost 8% higher than what we're projecting we'll spend this year, and that is entirely because of the growth in personnel costs. PERS rates, now here, we actually care about a different PERS rate. We care about the Tier 3 general service PERS rate and the Tier 1 and 2 general service rates. And the Tier 3 OPSERP general service PERS rates went up 45%, so that is a big jump. And the Tier 1, 2s went up 24%. And yes, I hope that it's kind of confusing when you talk about rates going up. I don't mean that we went from 20% to 65% PERS rates. I just mean that they grew by half again, and then they grew by a fourth for the Tier 1 and 2. We have very high COLA. This would probably be a good time to tell you that what we have built into the budget and what you see referenced here is a 4% projected COLA for July 1, but since I sent this out, we got the real number, and that's 3.9%. The city gives wage adjustments every July 1 based on the value in one of the consumer price indices. So that's very high. That's the highest we've seen in decades, the 3.9%. We had a couple of employees get pay increases with the implementation of the pay equity law. Those are outside of our control, some large pay increases there. And then we have these new compensation ranges, and we have uncertainty about how those are going to be handled centrally by the city. So we wanted to make sure we had more than enough to cover whatever we got thrown at us in the personnel budget. So I think this is higher than we need, but it is high for next year. The other components are growing more in line with inflation or staying the same. External M&S is growing in line with inflation. Internal materials and services are actually going down. We're having less expenses for the city's enterprise-wide software. I think that has to do with the retirement of debt, maybe. I can't remember. But those costs are actually going down, and then spending on the database we expect to stay about the same next year. Questions? There is, on page 9 of that 5-year forecast document you have in your book, a list of every single thing in administrative expenses for the board to look at if they care to see how much we spend on, actuaries and financial audits and subscriptions to professional paper. It's got all the detail in there if you care to see it. So now let's move on to revenues. We've already talked about this mostly, so I think we can go kind of quickly. They increase in step with expenses. I talked about why this year we have relatively low growth in property taxes because we're sitting on more money right now than we intended to be. So we can go out and ask for a little bit less next year. I want to talk for a minute. I want to make sure that everybody understood about the property tax gross up that we talked about during the actuarial valuation. When you see this number, when we say, boy, in 1920, we need 156 million in property taxes, if you were sitting at the county assessor's office, you would see a much larger number come through, about 8.3% higher to account for those delinquencies and compression and all those things that we were talking about before. And when we talk about risk in the property tax budget, sometimes we act like we're just going to the bank and getting the property tax money, but because of the loss from compression, the discounts, it's a little trickier than that. And if we miss on our assumptions for compression, discounts, and delinquencies, then we don't get as much money as we thought we were going to get. And that is a major reason to have contingency, because we have to be able to live with a few less million than we thought we were going to get if it comes to that. And when that happens, then everybody is, the general fund is also getting less money and all those things. So if any part of that wasn't clear and you're interested, please let me know. Assessed value, this is what property taxpayers are actually billed on, is limited to 3% growth on existing construction by measures 5 and 50. But the city economist is projecting growth in excess of that for the next couple of years because there's so much new construction in the city. And that is good for taxpayers because it means that, this $156 million bill we're going to drop on them is going to get spread among more taxpayers. And I think that speaks to a little bit of what you were talking about, Trustee Hunziker, earlier. Just a brief mention on other revenue. All put together, other revenues are less than 2% of our resources. The largest are interest income and interagency revenue. We talked a little bit about that interagency revenue. It goes up with PERS contribution rates because the PERS rate is the proxy for the pension overhead charge rate on that secondary employment. It goes up with wages. It also goes up with sort of police staffing levels because police has hired 86 new folks over the last 18 months, which is great. They have about a year, is this right, Trustee Hunziker, about a year training for new hires.
1.5.
What?
A year and a half.
Year and a half. So there's a pretty long lead-in time. They hire them, but they're not really available as an independent resource for about 18 months after they've been hired. But we are starting to see some of those big hiring numbers bleed into the force as independent folks now, which means that police has more capacity to take on that third-party work. They have turned quite a bit of it away over the last couple of years because they just don't have the capacity for it. So as they're able to do some more of that work, we'll see a little bit more revenue from there as well. Interest income, this is just rising interest rates on fund balance. And on this side of the budget, this is nothing but good news. Even in the current year, we're up quite a bit more than we expected to be. We projected 1.65% interest rates at this time last year, and we've averaged about 1.93 so far this year. I think we'll end a little bit higher than that, more in the 2% range for the year. So interest rates are rising more quickly than we had projected, and we expect them to rise again for the next couple of years. And we have more fund balance as we have to, pay more every year. Our fund balance is, our average daily balance this year is about 71 million, and next year I think it'll be about 75 million. So this is also probably a good time to mention that council,
I was going to add that council had approved adjusting the investment policy. Maybe this is what you were going to add.
This is exactly what I was.
Okay, I'll let you go right ahead.
Well, it doesn't seem right for me to talk about it
Go
when
right
you're
ahead.
sitting right there, but you can add to it. So you'll remember a year or two ago, the board was very distraught by a council decision to stop investing in equities because that lowered.
No equities in corporate securities.
I'm sorry, in
debt,
commercial
corporate
paper,
bonds.
right, yes.
Yeah.
And so once they decided to do that, the interest rate projections were lowered because they didn't think they could get as much return on fund balance without that. And so the board had a lot of discussions. I can't remember who all was on the board at that time, had several discussions about that and whether or not it was within their power to get council to change that decision because it was negatively impacting what we could earn. But council revisited that decision, and they are going to invest in corporate bonds again. As I understand it, there used to be a do not invest list, then there was a no, we're just not doing it, policy, and now there is a do invest list.
There is a very restrictive list of about 12 names that are eligible for the city to purchase, but the addition of that will increase the projected interest earnings for the city's investment portfolio.
Right. So I thought the board might be interested to hear that. And when I was talking with the city's investment officer last week, his interest rate forecasts do not reflect that right now. And so I expect interest rates will be even a little higher than we've built into the budget again, because he released those a little bit before council made that decision. And then we have a few other forms of more minor revenue, subrogation revenue, which we just have growing sort of with disability payments in general, and then other, which is mostly benefit repayment. When folks are on a service-connected disability, we begin paying them disability benefits immediately. But if a claim is denied or withdrawn, they have to pay those benefits back. And if they pay it back in a different fiscal year, it comes in as a revenue. Other questions about revenues or expenses before I talk about not flood level, but fund level expenses? Actually, I think really the only fund level expense that you all probably really care about is contingency. So the chart on your slide, on slide 16, shows fund balance, ending fund balance in yellow and contingency in red. And you will see that in future years for the budget and for next year, they're identical. Because if you spent exactly as you budgeted, your ending fund balance would just be unspent contingency. It would just, it would be like your savings account that you didn't touch. In the years where we have more fund balance than we budgeted for contingency, well, we underspent our budget or over-collected on revenues in those years. And that is what has happened for the last 2 years. And we expect to happen this year. We've over-collected on revenues with that Comcast property tax settlement, and we've underspent on the pension budget. So fund balance has been higher the last 2 years. How to set contingency is something we spend a lot of time agonizing over every year. We have decided to set it to 7% of Bureau requirements for the whole forecast period. Over the years, it has bounced around between 7% and 10%, mostly depending on the risk factors that we see out there in the world. The only real significant, non-routine risk factor that I see, and we'll talk a little bit about risk to the forecast here in a minute, is that the Portland Firefighter Association contract will be open again on July 1, and we don't know what will be in it. So we want to make sure that we have enough in contingency to cover, either salary increases or extra hiring or whatever may come out of that contract. And then in addition to that, we always want to make sure we have enough to cover any unplanned under collection of property taxes, unplanned retroactive payments, higher disability costs than we thought, more or a larger claim than we thought, or more retirements than we expected. All those, we want to make sure we have enough money to cover all of those different pieces. So we decided to set it at 7%, which is about $11.5 million for next year's budget, and it goes up to about $15 million by the end of the forecast period. We do have a really small reserve fund that we can tap into if we need. We have tax anticipation, notes that we can borrow more from if need be, and we have other funds in the city we can borrow money from if need be. We've not, to my knowledge, ever borrowed money from another city fund, but we could. So even if we somehow tapped out on contingency, we do have other places where we could go get some resources. Any questions or concerns about contingency? So last slide. You guys are almost there. Risk to the forecast. So I promise you that despite the fact that we spend months doing this and project everything 1,000 different ways and build crazy worksheet models and off of this, I promise you we'll be wrong at the end of the day. And it's just a matter of whether we'll be wrong to the good or wrong to the bad and by how much. And there are a lot of assumptions and a lot of methodological choices that could prove to be wrong. But these are 4 things that either I think we're especially likely to be wrong about or would have a greater impact if we were wrong about them. So the first, in underlying the budget other than these factors is just the fact that the truth that people retire and die and get disabled on their own timetables instead of our actuarially projected timetables. So they insist on doing that. So that human behavior causes plenty of variability from budget anyway. But then in addition to that, we have these 4 factors. Labor contracts, I mentioned the PFFA contract. It is always true in the 5-year forecast period that the 3 sworn contracts are open at some point during those 5 years. But the PFFA contract could impact next year's budget, which is why we want to be especially having that in mind as a risk. The risk there is pay increases or having to hire more firefighters, as could happen if there was an hours reduction in the schedule. That would cost us more money. We talked about PERS rates and the possibility that they could be higher than expected. Retirement rates, which are really notoriously hard to project. And as I said, we've had fewer retirements than we would have forecast using actuarial techniques for the last 2 years. And so we are asking ourselves, and Milliman will do another experience study next year, is this a new trend? Are folks just working longer and to a greater age? Is that a new trend, or is that the result of one-time sort of cyclical factors? Is it the result of contract uncertainty or uncertainty around 27 pay dates? So the risk here is that it's not an emerging trend and that we have a lot of pent-up retirement demand and that we suddenly get a lot of retirements in the next year or 2. And then inflation risk. The city has used in the past a different index for inflation, an index that is no longer published. It was the CPIW for the Portland-Salem Metropolitan Statistical Area. It's no longer published, so we have switched to a very comparable index, the CPI for the West region. It is our first year with this index, and the city economist is now projecting with that index. So there's the issue of switching to an unknown index, which I don't see as actually very significant, but inflation is very hard to project, and it impacts that CPI, that wage increase impacts almost every benefit we pay. So if we're off by a little bit, if we're a little under in the budget and we come out a little high, it ripples through everything. So there's a lot of exposure with that assumption. And I don't know if I mentioned before that we use the city economist's assumptions because he knows far more than I, although I nag him a lot about it. Why'd you do this? What about this? Did you look at this? Did you think about this? And I can't believe he still answers the phone when I call, but he does. And that is the whole shebang. Are there questions?
Nope.
Have none? Wow.
You've addressed all of our questions.
Yeah, either that or I should always make the actuaries go first and you'll just be so run out. I always say, and I want to say for the record, that after you adopt this, we may need to make minor technical changes to accommodate the mayor's proposed budget. He can't propose anything as it relates to us, but he may make changes at police or fire that we have to balance to. So I just want to make sure that we have the board's permission to make those minor changes. If we contemplate anything more significant than that, we will come back to you. And that may happen this year with the 27 paid 8 retirements in February and March. So we may come back to you at the March board meeting and say, "Ooh, we think we need to bump up the budget for next year because we had a lot more retirements than we thought." And I'll try to keep you informed of them, even of the minor technical things via email. We do know the COLA now, so yes, I just want to make sure.
Actually, Stacy, I did have one question. And it relates to, you were saying that FPDR pension contributions, FPDR 3, are the fastest growing. It's not the current biggest part of the
Right.
budget, but it's the fastest growing part of it. And that the contribution rate is going from 24% or so now and projected to increase to up to 38% at this time. So my questions to the actuaries before were, how well funded is that part of the plan to understand, how much of that is really paying off unfunded liability? And it sounds like there's some, but not a ton. So I guess I'm wondering what's happening that's causing it. Do you have any idea, or is this just something we can ask again at a future meeting? What's causing it to go up
So high.
50% over
So
the
high.
next 6 years?
This is, and Jennifer, please, Chair Cooperman, please feel free to chime in on pieces of this. But, I mean, the one thing I'll say is that OPSERP contribution rate does include the retirement of the UAAL, the unfunded actuarially accrued liability for the Tier 1 and Tier 2. There is some tier share, I don't think this is the right technical term, but tier sharing going on in that. And I can see by Trustee McLeod's face that this is unexpected and not, I don't know if this is.
Only because as not being a PERS employee, I don't follow these things closely, because I'm not a PERS employee, and it seems odd that one tier would have to pay off the unfunded liability for another tier, but I'm sure smarter people than me have.
It's a very large unfunded liability. And on the PERS website, in the board section, there's a very similar presentation from Milliman to PERS, as they did for us today, that clarifies much of this. It's a significant liability.
Okay, so it's
that's
just a
why.
cross-tier subsidization.
tiers,
Okay,
There is
thanks for
a-
explaining.
Yeah.
There is that tier sharing component of retiring that unfunded liability, which means that even if, the Tier 3 was fully funded, they would still be saddled with a chunk of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 liability. And I do understand that the population of Tier 1 and Tier 2 is dwindling. So you would have a really crazy rate on the Tier 1 and Tier 2s if they were retiring that liability just
On
with
their
the
own
active
membership.
Tier
Right.
1s and
On
Tier
their
2s. And so you'd have, I'm making up numbers, but say you'd have a 100% contribution rate on your Tier 2 employees and a 15% contribution rate on your Tier 3 employees, and they are trying to avoid that with the tier sharing. And then, of course, the Tier 3 portion of the plan is as exposed to, investment portfolio returns and all those things as the rest of the plan, in addition to that.
So in a way, you could argue that you're really simultaneously funding 4 different tiers of benefits, your FPDR 1, 2, and 3, and other PERS tiers of which don't have any members. Right, because part of your contribution rate for Tier 3 is going to support PERS Tier 1 and 2, and you have no PERS Tier 1 and 2
Yes,
members. So
yes,
in a
you-
way,
yes, you could say that.
Your tier structure
And-
for funding benefits is you're really funding 4
Yes.
tiers of benefits at once.
And I actually, have some, there's nothing I can do about that, but I have some agitation over that, in that we don't have any Tier 1 and Tier 2 public safety employees to paying down the liability with, and yet that is how the system works. Things are even more complicated by the fact that we are part of a rate-sharing group. We're part of the SCLRP, the state and local government rate pool. So our particular rates at the city are also, we have chosen to pool them with other employers, which makes my, agitation over this less relevant. In that we,
Always relevant to us.
But there's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
again, that they're like, well, hey, when you're in a pool, sometimes you get the short end of the stick and sometimes you get the long end. And so we are also in a pool with other folks, which adds even another layer to this. But yes, you're absolutely right. Great question.
So do I have a motion to accept the budget?
You do. I make a motion to accept the budget with the possibility of some minor changes that you'll bring back to us in March.
Thank you.
And a second?
I second that.
Great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will stay for the next item, which is the expenditure report. Let me know if you have any questions. We have costs through the end of December, comparing budget to actuals. And the only really interesting thing to point out is in the top part of the chart in revenues, you'll see taxes, which are the second line, and you'll see 136 million coming in December instead of November. There was a problem with the county assessor's reporting software, and they were unable to allocate property taxes to the proper funds until December this year. So that's my latest agitation, is making sure that that gets posted back to November and we get our interest earnings on that money, which I'm assured that we will. But that's the only thing that's really odd in this month's expenditure report. Any other questions?
Thank you. Okay, the next items are all informational.
Information items. So I will share just one thing about some legislative updates is that for the disability side and what will affect workers' compensation generally across the state, if it's adopted, is a legislative concept expanding benefits for post-traumatic stress disorder suffered by first responders. This legislative concept was introduced by Nelson Hall, who was a PFFA and PPA representative, but it is certainly something that is championed by others across the state. And what it does is it creates just a shift in the way the claims for stress or mental disorder are analyzed, both under the workers' compensation system and under the Fpdr system, which would mean that the concept as proposed is that it would be presumed that if a first responder files a claim for a stress or mental disorder, disability, it would be presumed to be caused by work. And the other factors that are usually evaluated in whole with that type of claim would be less important. It would be presumed to be caused by work. This is in the very early stages of evaluation by the Management Labor Advisory Committee, which is by statute ordered to look at workers' comp legislation just to see if the parties involved have any concerns with the proposed legislation and that. So Sam has been to a couple of the meetings that MLAC has put on just to hear what other stakeholders' concerns may be about the proposed concept and what will happen from there. The meetings will continue as different stakeholders come and present information either for or against the concept. And the Management Labor Committee then will make a recommendation. And that recommendation could be to carry on with the bill or to create a work group to look at it further. So it's still in the very early stages, but we do recognize the significance of that proposed concept and its potential impact on Fpdr. The one that was similar, even though for a different condition, is the cancer presumption that was imposed into the Fpdr charter by statute and adopted by council, and that is something that we follow now. So we do pay attention to these concepts as they're proposed, and it's difficult to say at this moment what steam it will gain as it moves along, but I know that what is really important is taking into consideration all of the feedback from the parties that'll be involved. And I know that Sam has had some specific information that he wanted to share with you. He's not being here today. I just wanted to kind of say there's more to come and that we are in the early stages of looking at the concept and its impact.
I've spoken to a few people about this, and I'm wondering, is the reference to PTSD intended to be a specific call out in the legislation to post-traumatic stress disorders, or is that being used as a slang term for all mental health issues? Because in the DSM, PTSD is a very specific diagnosis, and there's lots of others. Is it being used to represent a larger whole?
Yes.
I hope that gets clarified
Yes.
later on in the legislation.
Absolutely. That
Okay.
is something that is one of the things that people do want to clarify, is that it is not just for the PTSD diagnosis itself. It's for other mental disorders that are classified.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
If I'm not mistaken, I think it's actually described as a PTSI. They're calling it post-traumatic stress injury. So obviously, it has a different
okay.
definition than I think in what you're talking about. I don't know exactly what it is. But I had a question. So is the director or is the fund, are they just listening, or are they actually, is he down there speaking? Is he taking a stance? Is he using opinion? I think if he is, I think he should probably get some input from the board first on what we feel about it, maybe bring us the information so we can hear it from him and what he gets down there, and then we can make a decision how we want him to represent us when he's down there speaking, which is on behalf of our members. I know he represents the board as the director too, but I think our opinion and what we feel about it is important too, because I'm a huge proponent of it. I understand how it affects first responders, police, fire, among many other groups. And so I at least want to make sure he's representing us as a board. I'm not saying everybody feels the same way, but I think that's very important. If he's down there speaking on behalf of FPDR, that we're aware of what he's saying.
And mostly his presentation to MLAC has been about FPDR and the differences between the causation standards under our plan versus what is in workers' compensation, and also just getting information from
Yeah,
other
perfect.
stakeholders. So
Thank you.
So
and-
he'll be contacting us and updating us as to the discussions.
I'm sure that was what his intention was for today, so.
Thank you.
As far as other FPDR updates, we don't have any. So I think that one thing we can expect with a future meeting agenda item is more on the PTSD legislation that's being proposed, and anything else that comes up that might impact the fund on the disability side or on PERS side. I haven't heard of anything, but as we get more information, we would certainly share it with you.
Great.
Yeah,
Are
in every legislative session, there'll be PERS bills and there'll be property tax bills, and we will track them and provide financial impact analysis and, those kinds of things of those bills. And at the next meeting in March, we will have cost of living adjustment discussion for FPDR2s. It's our annual conversation. If there's anything particular the board wants to see, please let me know. It's my intent to come back with the modified PERS methodology and some conversation around that. And then I also want to talk with the board a little bit about the floor concept that we talked about last year and what that might look like, and when the board might want to fold that in to the COLA. So if there's anything else the board wants to see.
How are we monitoring, I'm sorry,
go ahead.
how are we monitoring those bills? I mean, I've been here a couple years and we're always monitoring, is Sam going down there, or do we have a lobby group? Do
Oh,
we-
yeah, so we're part of the city, well, do you want to?
Go ahead.
I feel like I've been talking.
I just want to
The-
get
the
clarification
Office
on
of-
how we're being notified and.
The Office of Government Relations
Yes.
is the point person for all the legislation, and we use an online system called Bill Tracker, where every bureau indicates who the legislative liaisons are, and the bills get pushed out to everybody. Sam is a legislative liaison, maybe you both are too, and bills get pushed out online for comment. And then it gets fed back through OGR and then back down to the legislature. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if there's going to be any change to the benefit adjustment, or since you're talking about that floor, if we could get the information, the sooner the better. It would be nice to be able to look it over so we're prepared and we don't have to ask you so many questions.
I don't mind questions, but definitely we will get you that at least 2 weeks before.
Okay, perfect.
I
Thank
think that we can always, I shouldn't say always, but pretty much always get you everything except the budget 2 weeks before, and that is what we're striving for now. So you have plenty of time to read through it, and if, you're always welcome to ask me questions before board meetings, yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.